Feel Good TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know I'm your humble host. The y'all mean of revolution. The dollar falls fast. U.S. assets collapse over Trump's imperial ambitions. Trump first the world. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Well, all hell is breaking loose. Europe is fighting back. Trump is messing up your financial stability. Let's get right into the content. Salute, family.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for joining me. Well, the start of this week brought a very familiar and deeply unsettling reality, the return of full-scale trade turmoil that is driven by Donald Trump.
Now, financially, y'all need to pay attention to what's going on, not just because of the World War III. World War III will hit your pockets faster than the bomb will fall on your head. The bomb will hit your pockets. And that's what's going to happen. Y'all need to be very careful.
Monday, the United States dollar slid noticeably after Trump threatened European allies with new tariffs over the weekend. There is an entire video with the details here on my channel. He did that as part of his aggressive campaign to take control of Greenland. The United States is $38 trillion in debt. It certainly cannot afford to purchase Greenland, to take on more debt to purchase Greenland. We can't afford that. The people of Greenland deserve self-determination. They want self-determination, and clearly they have a right to self-determination, while Trump denies them that basic right. The EU is shocked, so this is a complete circus. It is a nightmare scenario. The United States dollar reaction was very swift, and it reveals something far more important than a single day of currency moves. Investors around the world are once again questioning whether the United States is still the safe haven of the global financial system. Is it or is it not? The euro and the British pound actually both gained about 0.3% against the dollar, while stock markets fell on both sides of the Atlantic. At the same time, classic safe haven currencies surged. For example, the Swiss franc jumped sharply, rising around 0.6% and approaching its strongest level against the US dollar since 2015, in over a decade. This was likely a signal of unease, of significant unease in global markets, and for many investors, this is the warning light flashing red. Very bright red. At the center of this reaction is a growing fear that Trump's renewed aggression and trade offensives could trigger a broader reassessment of exposure to U.S. assets. The world has been on the fence about U.S. Treasuries for a while now. As you know, if you have been a subscriber of mine, I frequently discuss it in my videos. And so that overexposure to U.S. dollar-denominated assets has been a risk. But right now, tensions are escalating. The perception of the US dollar as a safe haven is now under even more strain and even more scrutiny. The dollar's weakness reflects anxiety that escalating trade threats could actually push investors to sell US assets outright, or at least in the best case scenario, to hedge their exposure more aggressively. This, of course, echoes a pattern that we saw last year. You may recall that when similar concerns actually helped drive a roughly 9% decline in the value of the US dollar. So it really has become a trend, as you can tell, a trend that is impossible to stop as multipolarity is accelerating. As I discussed in a recent video, even Canada, PM Mark Carney just went to China. So Canada is pursuing to engage China, to expand its cooperation with China. And that is a clear and a very deliberate shift to a multipolar world order, and the United States dollar will weaken over time as a result of that. The decline that we saw this week represents yet another erosion of confidence in U.S. institutions. The pressure on the dollar is not a short-term phenomenon, of course, but something likely to continue because it is driven by Washington's policies, which are unlikely to change in the near future. It is not just the Trump administration, of course. Foreign policy does not change dramatically when a new president is elected. So the decline is structural and it cannot be stopped at this point. What makes this moment especially significant is that the underlying US economic fundamentals are weakening. And again, I would refer you to my previous videos where I covered the rate of unemployment, the weakening jobs market, the US economy slowing. The US economy has slowed considerably, and interest on US national debt has been rising. That interest cost is actually surpassing other government programs. So it is a systemic deterioration, and global investors are keeping track of the numbers. This is why their confidence in the US ability to be fiscally responsible has been declining. Some large asset managers are already adjusting their strategies. They have been dialing back their dollar exposure in recent weeks. The constant questioning of the rule of law in the United States is one of key factors. This is something that's driving the entire world away from the US dollar. According to reports, some investors now see European assets as a safer place than American ones, even though Europe's growth outlook is weaker. This is a remarkable shift. During moments of global stress, traditionally, capital flowed almost automatically into the dollar and US treasuries. And that is no longer guaranteed. That is no longer the case. The Swiss franc's surge actually underscores that point. When fear rises, investors are increasingly looking elsewhere for safety. So yes, de-dollarization is very clearly accelerating. And I do want to point out that I'm not a big fan of the term de-dollarization because it implies that the US dollar will not be used. It will be used. It will be in demand, but the currency multipolarity is the framework that will take over, and we should expect that soon. Currency multipolarity is a more accurate term, I would say. It is a more accurate reflection of what we're about to see in the near future, with tariffs once again being used as a blunt geopolitical weapon. And by the way, this time it is tied to an extraordinary dispute over Greenland. Some fund managers believe that the so-called Sell America trade will return. That phrase actually describes a scenario where the dollar, US stocks, and government bonds are all falling together, something that runs effectively counter to the traditional idea of the US as the ultimate financial safe haven. From the perspective of global investors, the concern is that the behavior of the US administration may be undermining the privileges that the country has long enjoyed in financial markets. You see, the US enjoyed the privilege of the world using its currency, using the dollar as its reserve currency. This is a privilege that is a very valuable asset, and it's not the other way around. Using the dollar is not a privilege, but having your currency, your national currency, as a reserve currency of the world is an immense privilege that the United States has effectively weaponized. This privilege includes the dollar's dominant role, low borrowing costs, and an almost limitless appetite for US assets from abroad. And so that privilege has been abused and is now evaporating as we speak. Regardless of what the summit in Davos brings, it is fair to say that the damage to confidence in the United States and its currency and its institutions may have already been done. Even if tariffs are delayed or rhetoric toned down a notch, the repeated use of economic threats against the rest of the world, allies, and those who are not aligned with the United States, that is actually reshaping how global capital views the United States. The dollar's slide, the rise of alternative safe havens, and the global diversification away from US assets all point to the same conclusion. The world is no longer treating American political risk as unthinkable, and once that psychological shift takes hold, which it is at this time, it is very difficult to reverse it. I will definitely keep you posted on Substack, on Patreon, as well as here on my YouTube channel. Stay tuned.
I got to start this off with getting this little financial information to the front of the line that the U.S. assets and the dollar is collapsing. They've proven that. They're not going to tell y'all that, but it's all downhill from now. Y'all got to protect y'all assets or whatever financial y'all doing. Let the people wipe out your money, your portfolio, and your savings over their bullshit because they're going to make money out wiping you out. They're going to make money off of you getting wiped out.
Alright guys, so this economic war just keeps getting worse. Welcome aboard the USS Armageddon once again, and the last few days has really revealed quite a bit. Now the world is breaking away from the US, and that's why Canada signed $1 trillion worth of deals with China. Now Trump is also making a direct play for Greenland. It can't get any more obvious. Finally, G7 allies and NATO themselves, they can't deny the facts. Everyone and every nation is on the table for Trump to mess with. And truly, the justifications are getting crazier with each passing day. Besson said that the EU projects weakness and that the US projects strength, which makes it all right for the US to take over the territory.
Table, if the United States were to take Greenland by force, how would that be different than Russia's annexation of Crimea?
Look, I believe that the Europeans will understand that this is best for Greenland, best for Europe, and best for the United States. I believe that the Europeans will understand that the best outcome is for the U.S. to maintain or receive control of Greenland.
So Europe will understand that is the justification. And if you think that is Twilight Zone material, we are about to sail deeper into the storm. Now, as we mentioned before, the US really wants Greenland for both economic and strategic reasons. Both just don't make sense, but the US sees that territory as a base for future operations. Now, the world is outraged. Denmark is sending troops all the way to Greenland. Macron is freaking out and he's calling for retaliation. And Trump himself is just making the situation worse. He just sent the Norwegian Prime Minister a letter straight from Crazy Town. It doesn't make any sense. Trump's going to force Europe to kneel because he didn't get his Nobel Prize for stopping 8 wars. And I quote, "I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace." This is scary. And did Trump really use boat landings as a justification? Now, this part really takes the cake. I have done more for NATO than any other person since its founding, and now NATO should do something for the United States. It's these moves that really shows everyone how unstable the US has gotten. Foreign policy and economic policy isn't stable at all. Trump can literally do the unthinkable in the next 24 hours, and it wouldn't be surprising at this point. And because of this new Monroe Doctrine or Don Roe Doctrine, the world is losing faith in the US economy. Even if Trump gets Greenland, the amount of money spent to develop it would be epic. Over $1 trillion in the next decade or so at the minimum. Now, in the last 5 days, US bonds, they have been collapsing. The yield on a 10-year is going through the roof. It went from 4.13% to 4.26%, which is an incredible jump in just a few days. This is the highest level since September 2025. It isn't good for the economy because now borrowing rates across the country are going to go ballistic. Money is much more expensive now. Everything from mortgage rates to companies borrowing will get hit. Now, Trump's actions are undermining the very bedrock of the US economy, which is the ability to access cheap capital. And this locks the US into a future of currency debasement and the eventual debt default. And what happens if rates continue to stay high? The interest payments would eventually get unpayable. In the last fiscal year, the net interest payment crossed an insane $1 trillion. That's more than Medicare, Defense, or Medicaid. It's 50 times the amount the US spends on energy. The problem here is the growth of the interest payments. It is expected to grow by 76% over the next decade, and they will put it at $1.7 trillion by 2035, which is confounding. This is the Achilles heel of the US economy. It's something that China long figured out. Now, since 2022, the Chinese, they have been putting pressure on the US financial system by dumping their holdings of treasury bonds. The tariff war just confirmed Beijing's strategy, and it's really just self-preservation. Why would you fund your own containment? Does it really make sense to fund the administration that is working actively to clobber your economy? And that's why Beijing just sold another batch of US treasuries. They reduced their holdings by over $6 billion again in November. Despite the slight rebound in US bond values, then the Chinese, they are still out. Their total holdings are now just $682 billion. It's the lowest level since 2008, before China helped the US with their bailout. And now there's zero incentive to help Trump out, definitely not doing a trade war. The recycling of dollars into US bonds is the main mechanism of global trade. China would effectively vendor finance the US, lend money to your own customers to buy your goods. But if the US is no longer your customer, what is the point of lending them money? China earned over $1.2 trillion in trade surplus last year without the US, and this stockpile is going to grow even bigger. China's foreign assets have exceeded Japan, and through their various entities, Beijing is going to deploy the money around the world. They are putting it everywhere except US Treasury bonds. Since 2014, China's reserve assets haven't really increased. That means as China sells down the treasuries as they buy more gold, the net amount has not really increased. China instead is growing their direct investments and portfolio, which means investing into supply chains and buying stocks around the world. There's simply no space left for US debt anymore. Whatever exists today will only get sold off in the months to come. Now, this chart confirms what we've been saying for the longest time. China is focusing on buying real assets. China wants to buy things that produces other things. And a big shout out to our sponsor today, Indigo Precious Metals. When it comes to buying gold and silver, I trust Indigo Precious Metals in Singapore. They have made investing in precious metals safe, fast, easy, and simple for both small and large scale buying. I've been stacking gold for over a decade now, and I've learned two things when buying. You want to buy authentic gold bullion, and you want to buy it at the lowest premium possible to stretch your dollars even further. And I'm glad to say I found both of this at Indigo Precious Metals. Indigo Precious Metals is a leading retailer in Singapore. They specialize in physical gold, silver, and platinum. They are my one-stop shop when it comes to buying bullion. Their prices are sharp, and they have the best brands on sale, and I can test the gold on the spot. So if you're looking to make your first gold purchase, Indigo Precious Metals is the best place to start. Whether it's 1 ounce or 1 kilo, this is the reputable dealer you are looking for. So take action today. Click on the link below and enjoy a discount on your first purchase with the code Sean Fu. Start your gold stacking journey today. Holding dollar assets is like a hot potato. The value would diminish over time. Even if yields are 5%, even if yields are 6%, real inflation is much higher, especially if Trump wants to embark on his adventure to take Greenland and his plan to extract Venezuelan oil. We are living in a simulation. This is a wild timeline and everything doesn't make sense anymore. The administration wants to borrow money from the world to punish the world. Now, China isn't playing that game anymore. What's the point? But for Trump, this isn't good because the amount of money in China, the potential is enormous. Chinese households have $7 trillion in time deposits coming due this year, and they have limited options to pile into. Chinese bond yields are very low at under 2%. Real estate is also quite risky. The money is going to shift into China stocks and gold, and that's why Chinese equities are rising and gold keeps getting a bid. There are really few options for money in China today. Household investors don't really care about geopolitics. They care about earning a decent return, but even holding US bonds is a bad idea. The RMB, the Chinese currency, keeps appreciating while the dollar keeps falling. You don't want to hold US debt from a currency perspective. When you convert dollars to RMB, you might actually lose money despite earning a yield. And that's why it boggles the mind why Trump is just making things worse. As if the tariff war wasn't bad enough, he keeps reminding everyone that it is time to leave US markets and assets. And for NATO, they just got a rude awakening. Trump is going to squeeze them for Greenland. And it's not me saying it, it's Trump signaling what's going to happen, the unthinkable.
There are Russian destroyers, there are Chinese destroyers and bigger. There are Russian submarines all over the place. We're not going to have Russia or China occupy Greenland, and that's what they're going to do if we don't. So we're going to be doing something with Greenland, either the nice way or the more difficult.
So Europe is caught. Trump is going to do it the easy way or the hard way. Now, this sounds like some Godfather kiss the ring stuff. It's crazy, but for the EU, can they fight back? Now, there are some things the Europeans can do, some things the EU can't do, some things that will lead to direct retaliation and just make the confrontation even worse. Now, it's simple to think that the Europeans would simply tariff the United States. After all, the damage looks like it would be massive. The EU accounts for 20% of total US imports. That's over $300 billion of US goods flowing into the bloc. So if Brussels imposes a 20 or 30% tariff, it could cripple American exporters. The pain in the United States would be quite significant. But Trump still has other levers to pull. He could pull out of NATO and the defense agreements. Considering the EU is still fighting against Russia, it would freak Brussels out. The US can also counter-tariff Europe. Just raising the tariffs to 50% is as good as an embargo. EU exporters would also collapse in this case. So a direct trade war isn't something the Europeans can do without massive pain. And of course, Scott Bessent just want the EU not to try anything funny here.
Retaliation by the Europeans? How concerned are you? How concerned are you about retaliation? Excuse me, about the Europeans, this question.
I think it would be very unwise.
So what can they really do? Well, something we have talked about for length. They could emulate what China is doing and make it impossible for the US to fund their adventures. And that means not buying US assets and upsetting the entire financial system there. Now, this would be devastating for the US that needs asset prices to stay high no matter what. According to Deutsche Bank, the US has a big weakness. Yes, it has advanced AI chips. There is the US military and the world's biggest consumer market is all over there. All those are advantages for sure. But those are funded by large deficits that need foreign money. The US has to keep borrowing money not just from China, but from EU countries as well. In total, EU investors, central banks, and entities, they own more than 10 trillion in US dollar assets, and this includes treasuries and equities. The entire US financial system is one big house of cards, and the damage caused can be devastating. If countries refuse to buy US bonds, there's only one way left to fund those enormous deficits. The Federal Reserve, the US central bank, will have to print money. The money supply increases, and because fewer countries hold dollars, the US itself bears the brunt of the damage. Local inflation is going to go through the roof. This gets worse because the US is importing less goods from the world. So this tsunami of dollars will stay exclusively within the United States itself. Now, central banks in Europe also hold a ton of treasury bonds. It's on par with Asia, which has China and Japan as bondholders. Adding the UK, France, and Belgium with everyone else, we have a total of $3.6 trillion. That's 40% of total foreign holders. If you throw in China and Canada, which would probably start deleveraging more bonds, you have nearly $5 trillion at risk. So the exposure the US faces to Europe is real, and the exposure is significant. If Trump really takes over Greenland, we can expect retribution from the EU. Now, there are many ways this can play out. If this was a few years ago, the EU dumping treasury bonds sounds extreme, but it's now par for the course. That 3.6 trillion that Europe holds is just reserve assets. It's central bank holdings. If the EU wants to go pedal to the metal, they can start imposing capital restrictions on investment money. They could forbid or restrict EU investors and companies from buying dollar assets. It's the next level and is something that Trump or Bessent won't expect. Besides treasury bonds, EU investors could liquidate $2 trillion worth of US corporate bonds. Now, US corporations and companies, they face even higher bond yields. The EU walking away will hammer down on demand. yields will have to rise to compensate. And even then, they will have to rely on local US investors. The market starts to shrink. US stocks are also horribly exposed. EU investors hold 6 trillion in equities. Now the Nasdaq and the S&P at risk. Stockholders will feel broke and consumption will drop. And that's not to mention the chaos surrounding the AI bubble. That would also include and crater all those data center buildings. Projects would grind to a halt. Now this sounds like an extreme scenario, but let's get real. Trump taking Greenland is extreme, and it isn't a free win. Now what we outlined could very well play out when countries get desperate enough. It is not impossible. But let me know what you think. Will Europe retaliate and start dumping their dollar assets?
President Trump is acting like an international gangster. There are only two ways of getting him to back down: bribing him with a new jet perhaps, or a few billion in his crypto account.
We urge the US side to stop using the so-called China threat to use as a pretext to gain selfish gains.
That this isn't really about Greenland, full stop. It's not really about security, full stop. It's probably not even about one thing like oil as it was in Venezuela. It's about overreach and ego.
Some kind of rationale to explain this vanity project. We're looking for a rationality where a rational argument does not exist.
Something changed this weekend, not rhetorically, but structurally. When Donald Trump publicly threatened 8 European countries with tariffs unless they cooperated with his push for American control over Greenland. That episode has now crossed over from controversy into a test of how power is exercised inside alliances. Donald Trump did not frame this as an opening offer or as a negotiation. It was simply put as an economic punishment tied directly to going against his will and needing to get back in line into political compliance. In a Truth Social post on Saturday, Trump said the tariffs would be levied on those European countries that deploy troops to Greenland until such time as a deal is reached for the complete and total purchase of Greenland. Initially, this is to hit them at 10% on February 1 and then 25% on June 1st if they did not agree to his offer. But the escalation didn't stop with that public post. Behind the scenes, the next day, Trump sent a private text message to the Norwegian Prime Minister, Jonas Gahr Støre. In that message, Trump referenced not getting the Nobel Peace Prize, asserting that he had stopped multiple wars, and stating that he no longer felt obligated to think purely of peace, but instead about what was good and proper for the United States. Trump also questioned Denmark's claim to Greenland, saying, "There is no written documents," and adding, "The world is not secure unless we have complete and total control of Greenland. Thank you." That message was extraordinary, not because it was undiplomatic, but because it fused personal pettiness with state power, signaling that economic pressure was no longer merely instrumental, but rather a function of emotions and conditional.
Kind of got a really old-fashioned approach to diplomacy now, because once you recognize where Trump is on this whole question, once you see the letter to the Norwegian PM that spells it out, why are we running around talking to former diplomats? Why are we running around talking to former Foreign Office mandarins? We should be talking to psychotherapists.
Since the release of the text message to the Norwegian Prime Minister, many are now seriously suggesting that Trump is insane and needs to be removed from office, and that other presidents have been impeached for much less. On X, the hashtag Trump is unfit for office is trending in the politics section. Having said that, Donald Trump has his own share of supporters who like the idea of taking Greenland, including Ted Cruz. Alliances are not simply collections of shared interests. They're systems built on expectations. These are the expectations about restraint, predictability, and process. Between the US and Europe, NATO has been built on a system of give and take for over 80 years. When those expectations are violated, even without immediate retaliation, behavior begins to change. Of all the countries, the German foreign minister warned Trump that a line has been crossed.
Chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, I chaired a hearing on the benefits to the United States of America of acquiring Greenland.
Before Europe has even fully coordinated its response, China has also moved quickly to frame the movement. In a statement issued by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Beijing has rejected President Donald Trump's Greenland demand outright, warning that Washington needs to stop using the so-called China threat as a pretext to pursue its own selfish interests, basically. Accused the United States of instrumentalizing China as a justification for territorial pressure on its allies. Beijing's clearly positioned itself as an observer of this American overreach rather than a participant in the dispute. Now, the subtext of their message made it clear that the US was not doing this to counter China, but it's about power projection against its allied partners. Beijing made it clear that it's not a rival contesting Greenland, but as a critic, highlighted the erosion of alliance norms, talking about the UN international system. It weakened US credibility far beyond the Arctic. The Chinese statement comes at a time when the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney also disclosed in a press conference that Canada and China had an alignment of views over Greenland. There's also a personal dimension to this Greenland push that's becoming increasingly obvious. For Donald Trump, Greenland is not just strategic, it's symbolic. Trump's been long preoccupied with his legacy and a place in history. Last year, he reportedly took a particular interest in acquiring a portrait of James Polk, the American president that is associated with the largest territorial expansion in US history, and he wanted to put that in his office. That comparison matters because unlike concrete security needs, which are already met through existing basing rights that the US has and the defense access under the 1951 US-Denmark Defense Agreement, the acquisition of Greenland would be a headline achievement, a map-altering legacy for the United States, a move that places Trump alongside expansionist presidents in the history books. He believes that he may even get his face carved onto the mountains in Mount Rushmore. In that sense, the Greenland gamble increasingly appears less about unmet US strategic requirements and more about narcissistic statecraft, using the machinery of power to satisfy personal legacy ambitions rather than rational and national necessity, similar to his desires to get that Nobel Peace Prize. The initial reaction across European capitals has been unusually sharp and synchronized. In Paris, Emmanuel Macron rejected the tariff threat outright, stating publicly that sovereignty cannot be negotiated under economic coercion. The language was deliberate. This wasn't being framed as a disagreement, but as a line in the sand. Germany followed quickly. It reinforced that Greenland's future is a matter for Denmark and the Greenlandic people alone. Berlin's response also matters because Germany has historically acted as a stabilizing force in the transatlantic disputes, and it rarely goes against American desires. Alignment with France signals seriousness. At the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen has made it clear that Europe would stand behind Denmark and Greenland, emphasizing that self-determination and territorial integrity are non-negotiable principles. Now, what looks like a fight over Greenland is actually a test of how much leverage the United States still has. Is it still that indispensable nation, as President Bill Clinton once called it in the early 2000s? And what's going to happen when Europe pushes back? And China is calling it out quietly. Will the Europeans use for the first time what is being called the French bazooka that was actually set up to be used against China? More on that soon. Greenland is often portrayed as an eccentric fixation or a symbolic land grab. That framing obscures the real issue. Greenland does matter because it sits at the center of three strategic transformations, and they're happening simultaneously. I discussed these a lot more detail in my last two vlogs. Do check those out. But briefly, first, the Arctic is no longer peripheral. Melting ice has transformed that region from a frozen buffer into a navigable corridor now. Missile trajectories, early warning systems, and long-range surveillance is increasingly dependent on Arctic positioning. Greenland's location makes it indispensable to the architecture. Second, Greenland sits atop a critical mineral potential which includes those rare earth elements that are central to modern defense systems and renewable technologies, as well as advanced manufacturing. And in a world defined by supply chain vulnerability, access matters as much as the ownership. Third, Greenland anchors North Atlantic force projection. Control of the Arctic airspace and sea lanes directly affects the ability to move forces between North America and Europe in a crisis scenario. But as I explained in detail in my last vlog, the United States already maintains a major military presence on the island, including the Thule Air Base, which plays a critical role in missile early warning and space surveillance. And the Danes are more than willing to give it even more access, more bases. Denmark has been one of Europe's most pro-American countries for decades, until the recent crisis. But access through alliance consent is fundamentally different from ownership through coercion, which is what Trump is doing right now. Trump's approach has reframed Greenland from a shared strategic asset within NATO into a territorial objective, which is going to be pursued through pressure. And that reframing of the issue, and not the island itself, is what has triggered Europe's response. Trump previously floated the idea of acquiring Greenland in 2019 as well. At the time, the proposal was treated as being eccentric, even unserious. It generated headlines, but not alarm. This time, it's different, and there are three reasons. First, the demand has been accompanied by explicit economic and even military threats. Tariffs are no longer hypothetical tools. They've just been used last year, so the threat is seen being much more real. Second, the global context has now changed. Europe in the mid-2020s is not the Europe of the late 2010s. It's now much more energy independent. Defense spending and geopolitical awareness have all shifted. Third, the method Trump used has bypassed diplomatic norms. There were no preparatory discussions, no multilateral framing, no attempt to go around the issue within the alliance mechanisms. Donald Trump mentioned it immediately in his State of the Union speech to the American people, even before bringing up the matter with the Danes last year at the beginning, January 2025. Now, he skipped with that usual persuasion strategies that usually take place in such matters and went straight for pressure. And pressure or infringement of sovereignty inside an alliance to a European country is being interpreted, ironically, very different than pressure to those outside it. When the US government, for example, just captured Maduro recently, very muted responses came from the European nations. An immediate response has come from the European Commission president, as well as the European countries, saying that imposing tariffs over Greenland was not acceptable. The Swedish Prime Minister has warned the EU would not be blackmailed by Trump. The dispute has put the approval by the European Parliament of the EU-US trade deal that was agreed last year on hold right now. And European ambassadors had an emergency meeting on Sunday that discussed a number of options in retaliation if those tariffs are imposed. These include a package of tariffs of 93 billion euros, around $108 billion, on US imports that could automatically kick in on February the 6th after a 6-month suspension. Now, that 6-month suspension is because they'd already thought of this package when the EU-US trade deal was being designed at the time after Donald Trump imposed his trade tariffs on April the 1st last year, called Liberation Day. Now, these measures were designed as part of that trade defense toolkit, but they still remain legally viable, so they can be introduced now immediately. Counter tariffs would target politically sensitive sectors, not just economically convenient ones. And the tech sector is thought will be one of the major sectors that will be affected. The danger is not the tariffs themselves, it's the precedent they set between allied nations hitting each other on this way. However, President French Macron isn't happy with that. He thinks that the European Union needs to activate its powerful anti-coercion instrument if the United States does impose those additional tariffs in the standoff over Greenland. That weapon was first set up in 2023 and has never been used. It's dubbed as a trade bazooka. The anti-coercion instrument allows the EU to respond to deliberate trade pressure by third countries through measures such as tariffs, new taxes on technology companies, curbs on investments, limiting market access or restricting outside companies from that country from bidding for public contracts. Both the Commission and the member states have the right to seek its activation, but it would then need the green light of at least 55% of the member countries to vote in favor, which represent 65% of the bloc's population. And there is currently resistance to implementing this, at least as an immediate response to Trump's threat. However, even if Brussels was to activate the weapon, it could take months before any of these measures were taken place because of the way the rules have been set up. First, the European Commission has 4 months to investigate the third country, which is being accused of detrimental trade policies. Remember, this was meant for China, not the United States. Then the member states would have 8 to 10 weeks to back any proposal for action. Only then would the Commission have a green light to prepare measures to take effect within 6 months of that date. The EU says the time frame is indicative, but even just triggering an investigation under the instrument would send a powerful message that Brussels is willing to fight back against its important ally. The hope, of course, would be that it would never need to reach conclusion, as the two parties would have resolved their differences by then. Already, Trump's favorite European leader, Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, has been sweet-talking him and saying that he's misunderstood why the European troops were in Greenland. By lowering the rhetorical temperature, Meloni is to help prevent that dispute from becoming an escalation process into a symbolic rupture with the United States. At the same time, still remaining aligned with Europe's substantive position of preserving Greenland's integrity and preserving that diplomatic space for de-escalation without conceding ground. However, once this initial shock has subsided, a deeper question has surfaced across European policy-making circles, one that they might not be stating out openly, but it's clearly present. If economic coercion can be used this directly against them as allies, what are the limits that remain? While that question doesn't actually need an immediate answer, it will reshape future planning. And it sets the stage for everything that follows, whether it's trade disputes, alliance recalibration, strategic autonomy, or quiet hedging that defines long-term power shifts. That response reflects a deeper shift in European behavior. In earlier eras, similar pressure might have produced some quiet accommodation by the Europeans, or delayed objections, or even procedural deflection. This time, the answer was immediate and it was firm, not because Europe suddenly gained power, but because Europe's recalculated the risk. Let's see how they go forward with this, though. Trade disputes between rivals are disruptive, and inside alliances, they're even more destabilizing. And the transatlantic relationship is uniquely vulnerable because of how deeply integrated it actually is. One of the central flaws in the tariff threat from the United States lies in a basic misunderstanding of how European trade functions. The European Union does not trade as a collection of sovereign economies. They operate as a single customs, regulatory, and legal bloc. That means tariffs imposed on individual member states cannot be cleanly isolated. Goods cross internal borders freely. Supply chains span multiple countries. Custom enforcement is collective. Now, attempting to penalize 8 countries inside their system does not fragment the pressure. It actually amplifies it. European officials understood this immediately, which is why that initial response was not confusion, but straight coordination, including with the UK. The United States and the European Union are each other's largest economic partners. Annual trades in goods and services exceeds $1.3 trillion. European companies represent the largest source of foreign direct investment in the United States. American firms generate a substantial share of their overseas revenue from European markets. So this is not commerce on the periphery. It is foundational. Tariffs imposed at scale would not simply punish exporters. They're going to ripple through the manufacturing supply chains, consumer prices, and the financial markets. And this is why European retaliation, if it's triggered, would not be symbolic. It will be systemic. Historically, France has pushed the hardest for strategic autonomy, arguing that Europe must be able to act independently in moments of divergence. Germany, by contrast, has long prioritized transatlantic stability, and it's often acted as that brake on rapid European integration, especially in matters of security. In the Greenland crisis, Berlin, though, hasn't hesitated. Germany's aligned itself very quickly with Paris in rejecting the tariff threat and reinforcing the principle of sovereignty. Now, increasingly, more of the fellow members of the EU are agreeing to the idea. Trump's badgering over defense budgets, NATO contributions, and now the tariff threats has helped to bring over more countries towards understanding its utility, the strategic autonomy's utility, that is, as well as its need if the bloc is to retain its sovereignty. For decades, European compliance with the US leadership was often automatic and submissive, especially in security matters. That behavior was rooted in structural and historical dependence it had with the United States, military, technological, and political. Ever since 1945, the US was the indispensable nation. However, those conditions have changed. In practical terms, strategic autonomy now refers to Europe's capacity to make security decisions without an external veto. It can sustain defense operations if US priorities diverge. It can protect its economic interests from coercive leverage. And it can maintain policy continuity across the foreign election cycles. So it should not depend on whether Biden wins or Kamala wins or Trump wins or Vance wins or Gavin Newsom wins. It should be able to maintain the policy continuity. Europe today has, thank you to Mr. Trump, higher defense spending than at any point since the Cold War. It has much more internal coordination on security policy, a clearer sense of its own red lines, and greater energy independence after that 2022 Russia-Ukrainian war. What the Greenland episode has done is that it stripped away all the abstraction. It's now turned that long theoretical concept into a live operational concern. And it's important to be precise here. It doesn't mean they're turning anti-American. Europe's response does not reflect a turn against the United States. There is no talk of abandoning NATO, no rejection of American security guarantees, no pivot towards rival powers. They're not going towards Russia and China. European governments have just started to ask different questions. What happens if US priorities diverge? What happens if leverage is applied unpredictably? What capabilities do we need to ensure ourselves against that risk? And it's also going to mean that from the Washington's perspective, this shift will complicate future alliance management. Pressure that was once producing quick results may now generate much more resistance, even after Donald Trump is no longer the president. American power will take a drubbing. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was built to manage military risk, not economic conflict. So once trade disputes enter the alliance space, several dynamics emerge. First, trust becomes conditional. Defense cooperation is going to continue, but the assumptions will weaken. Second, public opinion is hardening. Alliances require domestic legitimacy, not just elite consensus. The same thing applies to NATO as applies to globalization. And we're seeing survey after survey showing that Europeans are not happy with the United States. It causes friction, which reduces deterrence clarity. So it's not surprising that defense analysts are crying hoarse, saying this is America shooting itself in the foot. Russian accounts have already started to amplify narratives of alliance fragmentations, portraying NATO as politically divided. Who blames them? Of course they would. While the United States remains militarily indispensable to Europe still, its intelligence capabilities, logistics, and nuclear umbrella cannot be replicated in the short term. But reliability is not only about strength. While European governments do not conclude that US will abandon them overnight, what they are starting to conclude is that US support is becoming conditional, and that recalibration means their own support also has to become transactional and conditional over time. So there's now going to be the end of this reflexive European alignment. And the net result may not suit the US over time, as a broader shift in global power dynamics means European compliance is no longer automatic. So when you step back from those tweets, the texts, and the tariff threats, what this episode ultimately reveals is not a dispute over Greenland. It's going to reveal the limits of pressure as a tool of leadership. The real shift is not going to be necessarily away from the United States automatically, but away from automatic compliance and subjugation to US power. I'm Nishma Minhas with GBS Deep Dive. Thank you for joining me today. Have a great day.
Enjoy robust. Well, the biggest geopolitical story of 2026 just unfolded last week as Canada, the United States' largest and most important ally, has suddenly made a dramatic shift away from the US and is now pivoting to China for a brighter future. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney traveled to Beijing this week, marking the first time in nearly a decade a Canadian Prime Minister has visited China. It was a bold move for the Canadians, and social media has been on fire the past week as many Americans are collectively losing their mind with Canada's decision to pivot to China. But if you think this is a bluff from Canada, just listen to what Canada's Foreign Minister, Anita Anand, said this week. It is necessary for us to diversify our trading partners and to grow non-US trade by at least 50% over the next 10 years. This is not Canada hedging against the United States. This is a strategic reversal. But Prime Minister Mark Carney gave a simple yet profound quote that honestly explains this entire situation in the simplest way possible. We take the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. This quote sounds simple, but yet it explains everything you need to know about Canada's decision to shift closer to China. In a perfect world, the US and Canada would be like brothers and enjoy robust trade between the two nations. This is certainly how Canadians wish the world to be. But 9 months ago, Trump launched a trade war against the entire world, including its closest ally, Canada. Multiple Canadian industries from steel, aluminum, automotives, lumber, and copper were all hit with high US tariffs. Tariffs and global instability is one of the major reasons assets like the US dollar have declined and the price of gold has skyrocketed in the past 12 months. But stay tuned to the end of today's video and I'll explain how you can profit from this. But instead of working with Canada, the United States' most important trade partner, Trump threatened to annex the country and jokingly referred to it as the 51st state. Canadians started boycotting travel to the US. American liquor was pulled off the shelves and replaced with local Canadian brands. And it goes without saying, the United States' reputation in Canada, along with Canadian views of Trump, have soured to a historic low at the end of 2025. And this is where the second part of Carney's quote comes into play, because Canadians are now taking the world as it is and recognizing the United States under Trump is not a reliable trading partner for the immediate future.
The one comparison I will give you with the United States, our relationship, this is no insight, is much more multifaceted, much deeper, much broader than it is with China. But yes, in terms of our relationship has progressed in recent months with China, it is more predictable, and you see results coming from that.
This quote from the Canadian Prime Minister would have been unimaginable a year ago, but it's hard to find fault in calling China the more predictable and reliable trading partner. Trump has imposed, paused, exempted, and changed tariff policies with Canada no less than 6 times over the past year alone. These on-again, off-again tariff policies make it almost impossible for Canadian industries to do business with the US, as no business leader can plan ahead, and every day you are subject to the emotional feelings of the US president. In his effort to conquer Greenland, Trump once again turned on tariffs against his European allies, with 8 countries in Europe now facing tariffs as a penalty to force their hand and allow the United States to acquire Greenland. Last week, I shared this tweet from Michael McFaul, a former US ambassador who wrote, "If Trump keeps acting like the leader of an imperial rogue state, more and more countries will begin to lean towards China, which will be perceived as the more rational, peaceful, rules-abiding great power." The ambassador's tweet has come true because Canada's shift to China is unprecedented and will have global ramifications. But unfortunately for the US, it may just be the tip of the iceberg. The Financial Times broke this story entitled "Trump is Making the World Fall in Love with China." Countries that once saw American success as their own now view the US as an adversary and Beijing as a model. Once again, this perfectly describes the situation in Canada, and this should be alarming to every US citizen because the data backs up these claims with considerable evidence. Don't believe me? Well, let's dive into the research and look at this report from the European Council on Foreign Relations entitled how Trump is making China great again and what it means for Europe. Because across the globe, most nations now have a very different opinion of both the United States and China. When citizens were asked, do you think China will have more or less global influence over the next decade? Every single country responded positively that China will have more influence, with even 54% of Americans also feeling Beijing will only get stronger. When asked the question, what do you think about China? The majority of countries, including 51% of US citizens, feel China is an ally or trusted partner with which we must strategically cooperate. But here are the truly shocking results of the survey, because look at how the world now views the United States. The same countries were asked if they felt the US was an ally to their country, and with the exception of India, every single country recorded a dramatic decline in how they view the US. Right now, only 16% of Europeans and only 25% of UK citizens think of the US as an ally. And when you ask these same citizens if they feel the election of Donald Trump has been a good or bad thing for US citizens, every single country responded negatively, showing a dramatic decline in Trump's popularity around the world. What's incredible about this survey is that it's from November 2025, long before the invasion of Venezuela and the increased threats to annex Greenland. Trump has no doubt shaken the globe, but the world is falling for China. Trump's major foreign policy theme for 2026 has been one of colonialism and expansionism. According to Stephen Miller, Trump's Homeland Security advisor, might makes right, and the United States will take new territory, annex whatever it wants, control the entire Western Hemisphere, and create a new world order. But this vision certainly doesn't align with Canadian values. And for some perspective on this, just listen to the words of Stephen Harper, who is widely known as the most pro-American prime minister in Canadian history.
This really is a wake-up call for this country to truly diversify its trade export markets. You know, that's why we did sign the trade deals all around the world, Europe, Asia, Pacific, the Americas. And Canada has been, to be blunt, this is, nothing against the U.S. The reality is, independent of the current disputes, Canada has been, to use business term, and I'm in the investment business now, we have been grossly overweight the United States as a country. And there is no reason for that. Just because we have that geographic proximity does not justify the degree of dependence that we have on a single market, which is sometimes disadvantageous.
This clip from Stephen Harper is so important to understand Canada's shift away from the United States. Stephen Harper was the Canadian Prime Minister from 2006 to 2015 and oversaw one of the most prosperous times in Canadian economic history. The economy became so strong that even the Canadian dollar reached par with the US dollar in September 2007 under his leadership. Now, the main reason Harper's economy blossomed was in fact a much closer and deeper relationship with China. Harper expanded trade with China, and many Canadian industries like aluminum and timber skyrocketed in profits as the Canadians were able to export their products to the quickly developing Chinese economy. So in reality, Canada announcing a new shift to China is not something new. In fact, it should be seen as a revival of past foreign policy objectives. But what's remarkable to see is just how big a missed opportunity this is for the United States, because Canada has always been extremely loyal to US interests. Don't forget, it was the Canadian government who arrested China's Meng Wanzhou, the daughter of the Huawei CEO, on behalf of the US government for Donald Trump during his first term as US president. Meng Wanzhou was under house arrest in Canada for nearly 3 years, causing significant tension between Canada and China, all for the benefit of the United States. You literally couldn't find a better and more reliable ally than Canada, but Trump has signaled to the world that his America First policy actually means America alone. And Canada is not the only country making new moves as a result. The EU just signed one of the world's largest free trade agreements with the two biggest economies of South America, Brazil and Argentina, along with Paraguay and Uruguay. This deal was 25 years in the making, but accelerated to the finish line because of Donald Trump's new foreign policy. Europe and China have also come together and finalized a price agreement for Chinese electric vehicles to enter the EU. Once again, this deal came about as a result of Donald Trump's trade war. But Canada's new trade deal with China is perhaps the most consequential because Canada has always been the little brother to the United States. And this new deal will change the future of the North American market. First, it reduces tariffs on two key products, EVs, and canola oil that will bolster trade between the two countries by several $billion a year. Second, it will slowly introduce a new breed of Chinese EVs to the North American market. As it stands right now, the United States is the only country in the world not importing Chinese EVs. But Canada will now allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the country, which represents 2.5% of the total Canadian auto market at a reduced tariff rate of just 6.1%, a massive drop from the 100% tariff Justin Trudeau passed against Chinese EVs in 2024. The world is already changing rapidly in 2026, and in just the first few weeks of the year, we've seen what feels like an entire year's worth of major geopolitical events unfold. Right now, the world's most powerful leaders have gathered in Davos, Switzerland for the World Economic Forum. And make no mistake, Davos 2026 will be dominated by one man, Donald Trump. But a major theme for 2026 is going to be precious metals. And just look at the reports from some of the world's biggest banks. HSBC just predicted gold could reach $5,000 an ounce in the first half of 2026 alone. JP Morgan expects averages around $5,055 an ounce by Q4 2026, with paths to over $5,400 in 2027. Goldman Sachs upgraded to $4,900 an ounce by the end of 2026, and Bank of America sees a clear shot at $5,000 an ounce in 2026. S&P Global Intelligence just published a report about severe copper shortages, and in this current bull market, I'm profiling a US-based gold and copper exploration company, which is the sponsor of today's video, US Gold Mining Inc., which trades on the NASDAQ.
A dangerous divide over America's attempt to purchase Greenland, to seize Greenland, however you want to phrase it, whatever President Trump is thinking about doing, but he wants to acquire and possess Greenland. And this is causing divisions both within the United States and within our allies, and certainly between the United States and Greenland, and the United States even in Canada. There's lots of friction going on all over the place. One has to ask, what in the heck is going on? What is the value here to the United States? What is it that's driving President Trump so hard to risk all of these negatives for what doesn't appear to be any genuine positives, but yet he seems just to ignore all of these threats and all these risks and to take it anyway? We're going to find out about what's going on with that. But I wanted to, first of all, just take a look at what's happening with our allies. So ordinarily, especially Great Britain has been our closest ally, and among all those in Europe, they have always been with us the most. And in fact, some say in Europe, in Ukraine, and I'm sorry, in the UK, that it is so strong they're like a poodle to the US or a lapdog or something to that effect. But now that when you see even Keir Starmer, who has gone out of his way to talk positive things about the United States and ignore anything that was bad in the past, even he is saying that this issue should not be a division between the United States and Europe or anybody else. It should be exclusively between Greenland and the Danes.
There is a principle here that cannot be set aside because it goes to the heart of how stable and trusted international cooperation works. And so any decision about the future status of Greenland belongs to the people of Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark alone.
Now, it's one thing to say strongly worded speeches and another thing to take action on that. So we'll see what comes of this in the future and going forward. What I think this is a pretty strong statement by Keir Starmer that they take this very seriously and that he's not just falling into line. So he's, at least rhetorically, a little bit more outspoken than he usually is. Well, it turns out that that wasn't even the most poignant thing he said in that speech, because he also, I think, more directly addressed the United States when he says, listen, international alliances are built on trust.
Alliances endure because they're built on respect and partnership, not pressure. That is why I said the use of tariffs against allies is completely wrong. It is not the right way to resolve differences within an alliance. Nor is it helpful to frame efforts to strengthen Greenland's security as a justification for economic pressure. Such measures hurt British workers, British businesses, and the British economy. And that is why I've been so clear on this issue. A trade war is in no one's interest. And my job is always to act in the UK's national interest.
Now, that last part there is important, because I don't think that I have heard since he's been in office to where he ever out loud said, my priorities are the interest of Great Britain. We will put UK interest above anybody else's if push comes to shove. That, I think, is a pretty strong indication of just how unhappy the British are right now. And by the way, if you hadn't heard this, when he's talking about the tariffs and a trade war, President Trump over the weekend said, listen, if you guys, anybody who opposes me on this and anybody who doesn't want to agree with this, especially from Europe, there's going to be a 10% tariff starting on February 1st. And if that still doesn't get the problem solved, if that doesn't eliminate the resistance, then I'll jack it up to 25% come this June. So that is what Keir Starmer was referring to when he said pressure, because President Trump is not just using rhetoric himself, but he's at least getting ready to take economic instruments to physically put pressure on anybody to get out of his way. Now, you may have also seen, I think toward the end of last week and over the weekend, there were small contingents of military folks from a number of European countries. I think Britain, may have been France, and I can't remember. Germans, I think, were also there, although they may have since left. But I know that there was a number of countries, 6 or 7, that deployed small contingents just to show the flag, so to speak. The claim was that this is an advanced party, so to speak, that then more troops could come later. Now, I think that was also a symbolism and a demonstration that, hey, we can put troops on the ground here. And if push comes to shove, we'll defend our interest. Now, I think that probably Stephen Miller, a week or so ago, I think we showed that soundbite earlier on a previous show, to where he's just mocked that idea. And he says, nobody is going to fight America over Greenland. And he's probably right. But that's not the objective here. That's not the marker to decide whether you should or shouldn't do something here, as to whether they're actually going to fight us over there. The fact that that's even on the table to discuss should be itself a big red flag. Why would the U.S. want to put so much effort and so much energy into taking Greenland? Now, the claim is that this is for our national security, that we're going to be putting this Golden Dome up at some point in the future, probably distant future. And as we've shown you with Ted Post, went through a detailed analysis of that. It showed you that the chances of that ever coming to fruition are next to nothing. And at no point is it going to be anywhere, even theoretically, in the near future. So the fact that he's pressing for this right now isn't matched by any kind of near-term national security issue, even on the Golden Dome issue. But he says we have to have it for that. And then we also have to have it subsequently. He said, well, it's because China and Russia could take the thing over, and we're not going to allow that, so we have to have possession of it. But look, here's the thing. If you think that China or Russia was going to take it, why wouldn't they have done it up to this point? Why would they have not done it at any point? Well, the reason's pretty simple. There are a couple of them. Number one, for Russia, they don't need it. Why would they want to attack and take by force of arms Greenland, which is not exactly, a stone's throw from the United States, so it doesn't gain them that much, even militarily, against the United States, when they already have an Arctic presence? You realize they've got a huge border in there. They already have an Arctic presence. They've got their own fleets of icebreakers, et cetera. They don't need this side at all. There's no benefit or no gain to them for the likelihood of triggering Article 5, because that's the other thing that's important to know. President Trump has also mocked the Danes for saying that if China or Russia did try to military take it, you couldn't stop them. Well, yeah, no kidding. They couldn't stop an invasion if it was in their own country. That's why they're part of NATO. Article 5 applies to Greenland. China knows that. Russia knows that. So they know it doesn't matter. There's only 50,000 people on the island. It doesn't matter. People, not military, just people, period. There's hardly any people there because the thing is this vast ice wasteland, as you may know. And there's, I think, like less than 200 Americans there, and they're basically there for advance warning already on radars and everything else against any incoming missiles that may come. So that's the reality here, is that the Danes don't need to be able to take it. And what are you going to do? Are you going to put like 100,000 American troops to militarily defend it so that the China or Russia can't invade, even theoretically? Of course not. There's no way we're going to do that. I mean, look, I don't think we even have at this point even 100,000 in all of Europe, where there is a literal land route to a theoretical Russian attack at some point here. But part of our Article 5 requirements there. We're not going to do that in Iceland. So if you say that the Denmark don't have the capability, we wouldn't either. If anything ever happened, we would rush forces there. But here's the thing you got to understand. There are agreements on the table right now to where we could expand our military presence there. The Danes, Europeans, the Greenlanders, there has been an agreement. I want to say 1951, I think that the one is at stake here, that would allow us to expand our military presence in the event that circumstances changed that required that necessitated that for a defense. So we could just, without buying anything, without taking anything, if national security was really the issue here, we could accommodate that by just expanding our footprint there. From all that I can see on the line, that is the capability. That was reinforced by the Danish Foreign Minister Rasmussen, who came to Washington, and he met with Vice President Vance and the Secretary of State Rubio. You may have seen, we showed you this last weekend, where he and the Greenlandic Foreign Minister were both, you could tell them they were very perplexed when they gave a speech or a press conference outside of the venue once they had finished with the meeting. And they said, well, we still have a difference of opinion. We gave our position, they gave theirs. I didn't really understand what was going on. Well, apparently, aside from that, or outside of that, in addition, there were other agreements that were made and understandings that were happening behind the scenes, and that Caroline Leavitt then subsequently went back in public and seemed to contradict what was agreed to there. And I'm going to show you here this. I think this is from actually today. Foreign Minister Rasmussen is saying he's actually very concerned about the nature of this because, and he's going to refer here to what I said a second ago, there is a path if national security was the issue for the U.S. to actually do something without taking the thing over. But here's how he put it.
And it must be understood that they share our views that more should be done to maintain security in the Arctic in the long term than it can certainly be achieved. And it doesn't require Greenland to be bought or otherwise taken over by the USA. And that's what we'd like to have a conversation about. And that is what we got. And it was a constructive conversation where we also agreed that we would continue to work on this and see if we can find a solution that will make the president give up the idea that he absolutely has to own Greenland, one that ensures Greenland's sovereignty and the territorial integrity of the kingdom, but which at the same time accommodates, one might say, reasonable our expectations and our requests. And that is what we agreed upon. And it's an agreement that, following the meeting where Trump's press secretary presented it somewhat differently, I've sought to clarify with those we made the agreement with. And I did. And therefore we will, of course, also, even though we are now faced with these threats, we will, of course, try to stay on that path. But it is quite clear to us all that it is truly disturbing that we are now receiving this kind of message from the president himself, which, as everyone can see, has not been triggered by any prior event.
Yeah, and that's what's really puzzling, even to me. What triggered all of this? Because if national security was the issue, it's easily solved. Easily solved. It didn't have to get to this level. You don't have to own Greenland. You don't have to take it in order to do what you want militarily. You can just do that right now. I don't even understand what the perceived value would be to take the country and to annex it, as one Republican congressman has actually put forth a bill to annex the darn thing, which is really strange. And we're going to see how that's going to play here in a minute and why that's a bigger problem than it may even appear. But why would you want to do that? Why would you want to take on the extraordinary cost to taking over responsibility for financial support of the island of Greenland and all the people that are on it? Because right now that's being shouldered by the Danes. Why would you want to incur cost that you don't need to without any obvious benefit? He doesn't understand it either. He doesn't understand why taking this risk of this rupture of the transatlantic alliance over something that is literally illogical, irrational, and even if you take the morality out of it, because there's certain arguments to be made that, well, I want this, I'm going to take it by force because I benefit X, Y, and Z. There is no X, Y, and Z. And as I'm going to get to in a minute, the economic stuff is also not valuable. It's not legitimate. There's reasons against that too. And there was no triggering incident. So something has happened that we don't know about. There's part of this story that has not been leaked or something else, because nothing that we see makes any sense at all. Again, stripping morality out of it. And even if it's a power play that I'm going to just take what I want from this person and for this entity because I can, because I would benefit from having this. There's no benefit. It's all cost. And none of it is necessary. And in fact, you could make the argument by taking this, that'll take you out of Article 5, potentially. Well, no, I guess it wouldn't. That wouldn't either, because then even if we took Europe out of the equation entirely, then if there was an attack on that, it would still be in America, so that would be the same. But there, you don't gain anything. But you already have it. That's the point. You already have an Article 5 guarantee to keep that thing safe in the event anybody did it without us spending another dollar. But that's where we are. And so that's why Foreman and Rasmussen's confused. Now, interestingly enough, it's not just in the transatlantic community where people are talking about this, but they're also talking about it in Russia. Now, one of the claims is that I mentioned a second ago is that Russia could come and take the thing over. And so when Putin was asked at a press conference, I think it was earlier today, they asked him what he thought. I'll tell you, he didn't answer the way I thought he did, but it is interesting.
Во время Второй мировой войны США разместили в Гренландии военные базы для защиты от захвата ее нацистами. А после окончания войны Штаты предложили Дании выкупить эти острова. Совсем недавно, по меркам мировой истории. Словом, речь идет о серьезных планах с американской стороны в отношении Гренландии. Эти планы имеют давние, как я только что показал, исторические корни. И очевидно, что США будут и дальше на системной основе продвигать свои геостратегические, военно-политические и экономические интересы в Арктике.
So basically, he didn't address this claim that they were going to come take it over. Maybe he just thought, well, that's so absurd and patently untrue. Why should I even address it? Instead, he just says, yeah, they've been talking about this for a long time. They talked about taking it over to keep the Nazis from coming in there. Don't know how the Nazis would have ever gotten there, but I guess that was a conversation back then. Also talked about they've been many times in the years since. It's been come up many times, but it's never happened. A lot of people say, oh, there's nothing new in this, the advocates for this. There's nothing new in this. People have been talking about this, all the way back to President Truman and whatever, but it's never happened. And there's always been a reason, because we didn't need it. Whatever you thought theoretical or hypothetically you might gain from it, once people started doing the cost analysis and the cost benefit analysis and all that, they saw, yeah, there's a lot more cost and a lot less benefit. So yeah, this is dumb. There's a reason why we never did it. Not because we couldn't, but because we shouldn't, because it wouldn't benefit us. That's why we didn't do it. So you can talk about the fact that it's been discussed for decades, but you simultaneously have to talk about that there's a reason why we said no each time. No one prevented us from doing it. It's just that we saw that to use our power to compel compliance when other people weren't willing to do it was just not worth it, because we don't gain anything for it. And that's still the truth today. But then we want to look at somebody else who was talking about the past. That was President Putin talking about the past. Turns out Secretary of Treasury Bessent also likes to talk about the past.
For over a century, American presidents have wanted to acquire Greenland. And what we can see is that Greenland is essential to the U.S. national security. We're building the Golden Dome, the missile system. And look, President Trump is being strategic. He's looking beyond this year. He's looking beyond next year to what could happen for a battle in the Arctic. We are not going to outsource our national security. We are not going to outsource our hemispheric security to other countries.
Okay, this is one of those cases where that briefs well. And unfortunately, NBC did not push back on this. They just basically let him make this statement as though it were a true statement. We need this for our hemispheric security. And it sounds good. It sounds strong. We are not going to outsource our security to anybody. Well, we have relied on the Transatlantic Alliance to help, not outsource, but certainly bolster our national security. It's always been part of the Article 5 requirements, which also benefit us, which has been used in the aftermath of 9/11, for example, and has always been a threat that, or has always been a positive that in the event that we were ever attacked or did NATO, that we were all going to be there together. So we've always had this mutual security issue. So that's not new either. But the idea that we're going to outsource it, what does that even mean? Because you're saying we're not going to outsource it. And if we don't have Greenland, then that will be outsourcing it. Therefore, then we've always outsourced it, according to your logic, because we haven't had it. So if that would be outsourcing, then that is outsourcing. And he said, we're not going to do that. But then you understand what I'm saying here. He's contradicting himself with this it's kind of circular logic that's also broken because it doesn't make sense. Our security is not at stake there. And this idea that we need it for national security is nonsense. I did a whole show on this over the weekend. Go back and look. I think it's on our video tab where I did an analysis of militarily, and especially when you look at the routes that China would have to go from its naval bases, either on the east side or the west side. They would have to go I think they would have to go all the way around Africa in one side, and they would have to go past our allies and our military bases in South Korea and in Japan. They would have to go past Alaska up in the north, then come. There's no chance they could do that. There is zero chance that they could ever do that. That they could move. Yeah, that's one. Trump's Greenland grab right there. Be sure and watch that one. Or maybe it's the Trump's Greenland. I think it's the Greenland Obsession is the one where I do that military analysis in that. So take a look at those two. That'll give you all the details you need there. But the bottom line is it is a literal impossibility for China to ever invade Greenland. Their military would be chewed up thousands of miles before they ever even got close to the actual landing people on the shore. They're already going to have enough trouble, even theoretically, taking Taiwan 100 miles off its shore where all of its combat power is there. So many experts say that they don't think that China could successfully do that without extraordinary cost beyond what they could cost. Now, just imagine the irrationality that somehow they would be able to project power thousands of miles around the world to get up into there when they can't even allegedly do it 100 miles across the Taiwan Strait, when all of their air bases and all of their naval bases are sit there in direct support. You see what I'm saying? People aren't doing this kind of analysis. It's not going to happen. It's not impossible. Well, one thing to NBC's credit that they did ask is they said, now, this logic that you're trying to portray here and that you're going to take this one because you need it for your national security, you're not going to allow China or Russia in our hemisphere to come and potentially invade someplace, so you're going to take it. That's kind of contradictory because that's the opposite of what we're saying to China and Taiwan and to Russia and Ukraine. Watch his answer.
If the United States were to take Greenland by force, how would that be different than Russia's annexation of Crimea?
Look, I believe that the Europeans will understand that this is best for Greenland, best for Europe, and best for the United States.
So, but military action is still on the table?
I haven't spoken with the president on that. And again, I believe that the Europeans will understand that the best outcome is for the U.S. to maintain or receive control of Greenland.
Okay, for the credit she got for asking the question, she didn't get credit for not asking the obvious second question. He didn't answer her question. She said, how is this not like Russia annexing parts of Ukraine? How is this not like them seizing by force Ukraine? He didn't answer it. All he said was, I think that the Europeans will see it's in their interest. She should have said, that's not the question I asked you. If you take it by force, how is it different than that? If they don't agree to it, what are you going to do then? If China says, we need Taiwan for our national security, we are not going to allow this military, even quasi-alliance with the United States or the West or Japan or anybody else, we're not going to allow that. So we're going to seize Taiwan by force, which they claimed that they were willing to do. And we always condemn that. How can it be that you're going to say China and Russia are wrong for what the Russians have done and what the Chinese are threatening that they might do someday, and what you're saying we're on the verge of doing here in our hemisphere? I mean, man, Taiwan is 100 miles across the strait. Ukraine is on the border with Russia. This one is in the hemisphere. I don't even know the exact number. It's probably more than 1,000 miles away from the United States in the closest point. It's way away, a world away practically. And you're saying that we can do that. We can seize and take Greenland, but China and Russia can't. Not only can they not take Greenland, they can't even take areas on their border or right across the water border from them. Now, that should be right. The world would be a lot better place if China didn't take Taiwan. And it would have been a better place if Russia hadn't have invaded to try and annex those areas in their country. Obviously, the Russians don't agree to that. But internationally, other countries would say it would be better. But here's what you can't do, folks. You cannot tell the Russians what you did in Ukraine and annexing those territories is wrong and a violation of international law. You cannot tell China that what you are claiming and threatening to do against Taiwan is a violation of international law. It's wrong and it may be resisted fiercely. But we are going to do it, not even against an adversary, but our allies. We are going to take this because we want it. There is a law or a bill in the House of Representatives right now to annex Greenland. Not hyperbole, it's an actual bill. Now, whether it goes anywhere is a separate issue, but the fact that it exists shows that that's what some people are thinking. I haven't seen anybody in the administration say that's a dumb idea, take it off the board. It's a Republican that put it up there. So whether it's annexation or just taking it, whatever that actually means militarily, it's still unclear what that means. Purchasing it, whatever, you're acquiring it by force because they don't want it. The Greenlanders don't want to be acquired. The Danes don't want to give it up. They have fiercely resisted that. I just showed you their foreign minister. They are unequivocally against it. The prime minister of Greenland himself is categorically against it. He was emphatic over the weekend that no, no, no. But right now we're continuing on. And this just is part of a larger issue, is this mentality that forget about the rules-based order. There is just one set of rules. And it actually is not contradictory. And those rules are, we set the rules. We will decide what Ukraine can do. We will decide what Russia can do. We will decide what China can do. We will decide what Taiwan can do. We will decide what Israel will do, in a sense. Certainly what Iran will do. We get to decide that. We will decide what Europe is going to do. We will call the shots for literally everybody. And when we want to do the opposite, the absolute literal opposite of what we're telling everyone else they can't do, shut up. Don't tell me that, because that's kind of how we've always done business. We just take things. And if you think I'm exaggerating there, here is Senator Ted Cruz saying it out loud.
And now some folks in the press, they clutch their pearls and they say, well, what do you mean acquiring Greenland? How could that happen? Look, the whole history of America has been a history of acquiring new lands and new territories. Whether you go back to Thomas Jefferson making the Louisiana Purchase, about half of the United States of America today, yeah. or you go back to America purchasing Alaska from Russia. You want to talk about, at the time they called it Seward's Folly. It turned out to be an extraordinarily consequential purchase. Greenland has massive rare earth minerals and critical minerals. There are enormous economic benefits to America. Yeah. But it's also, like Alaska, it is located on the Arctic which is a major theater for potential military conflict with either Russia or China. It's also critical for the Golden Dome and defending America from potential missile strikes.
Okay, I've already told you that's complete nonsense, and I've told you exactly why. That's BS, that it's necessary for American national security. I mean, what? We haven't been secure since the end of World War II. I mean, come on, man. That's 80-something years this relationship has existed. So obviously we don't need it for our national security. We can definitely secure ourselves. Our nuclear triad is what keeps us safe. This mythical Iron Dome or Golden Dome that may someday exist, I don't think it'll ever exist. It is way too expensive. The technology is not there. And every time you start advancing interceptor technology, the offensive technology surpasses it. And that'll never stop. So you could spend trillions of dollars over an extended period of time, and you're still not going to keep yourself safe from that, as exampled by the Oreshnik missile right now. So even the theoretical future technology of the so-called Golden Dome already wouldn't stop it from right now. And you know those are only going to continue on. So that's a fool's errand. That's not what keeps us safe. It's not what will keep us safe. What will keep us safe is our nuclear triad. So anyone knows if they launch missiles at us, and it comes nowhere, wherever it may come from, they know that there's probably going to be 5 nuclear missiles going back in return. No one's going to do that. That's why the mutually assured destruction concept has kept the peace between nuclear powers, and it will continue to keep the peace unless somebody does something insane, and I hope it's not us. But you see the point being that that's nonsense. And then his claim that we've always been in territorial acquisition, and he gives these examples of the Louisiana Purchase and the purchasing Alaska. Okay, those are not analogous to this. In those cases, we had a willing seller. We paid them money. We paid it to the Russians in one case and to France in the other case. So we made a good deal. Turned out to be really good for us. Both sides mutually agreed to it. That's not the case here. And you talk about just acquiring territories. You make it the clear implications are that this is like, I think it was President Trump that said it last week. We can do it the easy way, or we can do it the hard way. That's gangster kind of talk, folks. This is kind of analogous to that too. Well, we can acquire it by whatever means. He said we can pay for it this way, or the implication being we'll just take it, which is what Trump's been saying. And he's not even embarrassed about that. A sitting United States senator, obviously Lindsey Graham is even worse than that. We could probably pull up some sound bites on him from this stuff too, because he just wants to take it, just like he wants to do in an Iranian situation, et cetera. Doesn't matter any rules, doesn't matter any laws. You've heard Lindsey Graham. I did a whole show on this a week or so ago, to where the rule of law doesn't exist. I've shown you a compilation of a bunch of sound bites where people are saying in the aftermath of the Maduro siege, but yeah, you know what? There's just the rule of the jungle, and we're the lion. Some people were bragging about it. Listen to me carefully, folks, here. Aside from being morally wrong, and aside from being foolish policy, it's self-destructive, because eventually you're not going to be the lion. Even the lions sometimes get old, and there are other either younger lions that come up or packs of other like hyenas or something, and then you're outnumbered. You're never going to stay on top. It doesn't happen in sports. It doesn't happen in business. It doesn't happen in empires. There's going to come a day when we're not. And believe me when I tell you, the things that we've been doing lately, the war we may be about to start militarily with Iran, what we have done with Venezuela, what we're promising to do in Greenland, even against our allies, is not going to be forgotten. Even if we eventually succeed and coerce our way to get this, it's just building up angst and anger among allies and adversaries. And at a time when it is probably the maximum inconvenience, those tables are going to turn. They always do. And when those tables turn, do you want people then remembering, well, when these guys were really strong, they always held a hand out and they helped a brother up. They were helping us when we needed help. When they could have exploited us, they didn't. They actually offered us assistance and gave us respect and honor and dignity. So now that they're on the backside, well, let's treat them the same way. That would be great if that day existed when the tables do turn. But instead, what we are going to have, what we've earned so far, is that they are relishing the moment when they finally are on the upside. And now then we are not in a position of power, and we can't just compel our way short of nuclear destruction of the globe. And they will exploit us. And they will remember then when we were on the upside and they were on the powerless down. And when those flip around, as they will, they're going to be happy to exploit it. And we will rue the day when we don't have the power. And these kinds of sound bites from whether it's Lindsey Graham or Ted Cruz here or Scott Bessent or President Trump, they're all going to be played again, and people are going to remember. And Americans, those people who may be kids right now, who are not calling these shots but are going to pay the price for it, because all they can do now is grit their teeth, and they'll just have to suck it down, just like the people of Venezuela sucked down what happened there, like the people of Iran sucked down what happened in June of last summer, and like the people of Greenland might have to suck down what happens here. Because right now it's hard for me to see how Trump stops. I don't know that words are going to stop him. I don't know that this kind of warning is going to stop him, but I fear that it won't. And I worry what happens if he does move forward. And we had a show earlier today talking about the potential with Iran and what would happen there. They may finally just say they're fed up with it now. They might not even wait, and they may start striking other targets, and we could find ourselves sucked into a war we can't win and shouldn't have ever fought. That's what I'm worried about, folks, here. That's why these issues are a lot bigger than they seem. And, and I'm not just making fun of different people here or mocking people for, like Bessent or Cruz for making these statements. It is a genuine warning, that if we keep going down this path here, it's going to harm ourselves and our future generations who right now are kids and don't have anything to do with it. Because the tables will always turn. They have throughout recorded human history, and this will never be a difference. You are never always on top. And you should, with wisdom, be taking actions now so when that inevitable day comes, people will remember you fondly instead of looking forward to exploiting you eagerly. That's where I think we're heading. Love to see it be proven wrong. Love to see
One of the clearest examples of this hypocrisy is the fact that in 2025, the so-called Peace Prize was given to the leader of Venezuela's far-right opposition, Maria Corina Machado. And she had spent years lobbying the U.S. government to attack her country, which is exactly what happened on the 3rd of January, 2026. The Trump administration bombed Venezuela, killing more than 100 Venezuelans, and kidnapped the internationally recognized president of Venezuela, Nicolás Maduro. And this far-right opposition figure, Maria Corina Machado, was so happy and so grateful to Donald Trump that she gave him her Nobel Peace Prize as a gift. And on the plaque that she gave him, she said he was, quote, promoting peace through strength, advancing diplomacy, and defending liberty and prosperity, end quote. She then praised, quote, President Trump's principled and decisive action to secure a free Venezuela. She was talking about the U.S. government bombing her country, killing more than 100 Venezuelans, including civilians, and attacking civilian sites, like, for instance, a medical supplies distribution center that was bombed by the U.S. military, destroying a warehouse which stored supplies for dialysis patients, which means that now thousands more Venezuelans will likely die because of this U.S. attack on civilian areas in Venezuela. And yet, the so-called Nobel Peace Prize for 2025 was gifted to Donald Trump after he carried out these war crimes. You cannot make this stuff up. This shows how the so-called Nobel Peace Prize was being used to manufacture consent for a U.S. war. It is not an exaggeration to say that the so-called Peace Prize is literally an instrument of U.S. war and imperialism. And let's keep in mind here that Venezuela is not the only country that Trump has attacked. In fact, Trump now has a record. He has bombed more countries than any other president in U.S. history. And a lot of U.S. presidents have been war criminals, but Trump has taken it to a new level. And in his 2 administrations thus far, he has bombed 10 countries, including just in 2025, he bombed 7 countries. And now Trump is threatening to attack other countries, including Mexico and Cuba and Colombia and Greenland. The list keeps getting longer and longer. So everything about the Nobel Peace Prize is extremely hypocritical. Going back to the origins of the prize itself, it is based on the fortune of the man who invented dynamite, one of the most destructive weapons in modern history. His name was Alfred Nobel. He was from a very wealthy family and he was a businessman. And one day a newspaper accidentally reported that he had died, and his obituary referred to him as a, quote, merchant of death, and said he, quote, became rich by finding a way to kill more people faster than ever before, end quote. This horrified him, so when he actually did die, in his will, he left behind his fortune in order to fund the Nobel Prize. But that's barely scratching the surface of the hypocrisy. Today, I'm going to be showing how the so-called Nobel Peace Prize in reality is a political tool that is used to advance the foreign policy interests of Western governments, and in particular, the United States. And if you go to the website of the Nobel Peace Prize, you can see that they admit that the prize is not actually about peace. The prize is principally given to people who defend so-called democracy and human rights. And when Western governments, and especially the US government, say democracy and human rights, they actually mean political operatives who serve US foreign policy interests, including war criminals. Henry Kissinger, one of the worst war criminals in modern history, also won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1973 after negotiating a ceasefire in Vietnam, after overseeing the war in Vietnam, in which millions of Vietnamese were killed by the United States in a war of aggression. So he literally had the blood of millions of Vietnamese on his hands, not to mention millions of Bengalis in the Bengali genocide. When the US supported Pakistan under Nixon and Kissinger, they backed Pakistan in its genocidal war against Bangladesh in the Bangladeshi War of Liberation, and many other crimes in Cambodia and Laos. The Chile coup in 1973, when the CIA overthrew Chile's democratically elected socialist president, Salvador Allende, and installed a far-right military dictator, Augusto Pinochet, that was the work of Kissinger. And yet he won the Nobel Peace Prize, a complete farce. Former US President Barack Obama also won a so-called Nobel Peace Prize. He then went on to bomb Libya, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. He overthrew the government in Libya in 2011 in a war based on lies. He backed an extremely brutal war in Yemen that was basically genocidal. Hundreds of thousands of Yemenis died in this US-backed Saudi war. Saudi Arabia was using US bombs and US military assistance. And this war started under Obama and was later continued by Trump. Obama also carried out the dirty war on Syria that ultimately led to the overthrow of Syria's government. He continued the military occupation of Afghanistan, which went on for 20 years. This is the guy who won the Nobel Peace Prize. It's a complete joke. In 2016, which was Obama's last year in office, his government dropped over 26,000 bombs, including 12,000 bombs on Syria, 12,000 bombs on Iraq, over 1,000 bombs on Afghanistan. And I haven't even mentioned all of the horrific drone strikes that were carried out, including the Obama administration bombed weddings in Yemen and schools. The fact that he won a Nobel Peace Prize is a complete farce. Now, that's clearly the most obvious example of the extreme hypocrisy of the so-called Nobel Peace Prize. But today I'm going to be making another point. I'm going to be showing how the Nobel Peace Prize is in fact a political prize. Many of the winners, many of the Nobel Peace Prize laureates are regime change activists who have been funded by the US government in order to destabilize the governments of US adversaries, especially countries like China, Russia, Venezuela, Iran, Belarus, Cuba. And in fact, multiple winners of the so-called Nobel Peace Prize have advocated for the US military to invade their country in the name of defending so-called democracy and human rights. They have not supported peace. On the contrary, they supported the US invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan and the wars on Libya and Syria and Yemen, and called for a war on Iran, all in the name of so-called democracy and human rights. What they're essentially trying to argue is that war is peace. They're rewriting the definition of peace through the so-called Nobel Peace Prize to justify US imperial wars. What this shows is that the so-called Nobel Peace Prize is in reality a tool that is used to fund regime change activists who are trying to destabilize and overthrow governments that the US and its European allies have targeted and have deemed authoritarian, in scare quotes. But when they say authoritarian, they simply mean any country that does not obediently follow Western foreign policy interests, like China, like Venezuela, like Iran. And the amount of money that we're talking about here is very substantial. Every winner of the Nobel Peace Prize is given 11 million Swedish krona. That is equivalent to roughly 1.2 million US dollars. And for the most part, that money is not going to support people who are advocating for peace. There is a small handful of exceptions, but the majority of Nobel Peace Prize laureates are regime change activists backed by Western governments who are trying to destabilize independent governments in countries targeted for regime change by the United States. And many of the winners of the Nobel Peace Prize have been funded by the US government through the CIA cutout, the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED. Now, the fact that the National Endowment for Democracy is a front for the CIA was admitted by the Washington Post back in 1991 in a very revealing article titled Innocents Abroad, The New World of Spyless Coups, which was published by David Ignatius, who's a close ally of the CIA. This article revealed that the reason that the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, was founded in the 1980s under the Reagan administration is because the US wanted to continue CIA operations to destabilize foreign governments, but it wanted to do it overtly as opposed to covertly. It was a change in the imperial strategy. And the co-founder of the NED, Alan Weinstein, said in this interview, quote, "A lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA," end quote. Now, in the rest of this analysis today, I'm going to go through some recent winners of the so-called Nobel Peace Prize and show how many of them have been funded by this CIA cutout, the National Endowment for Democracy. The perfect example of this is the 2021 winner, Maria Ressa. She is a political activist and a journalist from the Philippines, and she was not given the award because she supports peace. She's against war. No, the official website admitted that she was given the so-called Nobel Peace Prize because she supports freedom of expression and democracy, which is another way of saying that she was a political activist, a pro-Western, pro-US political activist who was campaigning against the previous president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, who was an ally of China. And the US saw Duterte as a major obstacle to US influence in the Pacific region as the US wages a new Cold War on China. So the Nobel Peace Prize was given to this pro-US, US-funded Filipina activist, Maria Ressa, who was the co-founder of a media website called Rappler. And what was the main funder of Rappler? The National Endowment for Democracy, the CIA cutout. And then 1 year after this US-funded activist won the so-called Nobel Peace Prize, the so-called World Movement for Democracy at the National Endowment for Democracy appointed her as the chairperson of its steering committee. So again, this has nothing to do with peace. This is a political award that is usually given to US government-backed regime change operatives. Not always, not 100% of the time. There are some noble exceptions, but usually this is the case. Let's look at another example here. The so-called Nobel Peace Prize in 2021 was actually shared. It was given to two people. The other winner that year was a Russian pro-Western activist named Dmitry Muratov. And once again, the official website admitted that he was not given the award because of peace. He was given the award because of freedom of expression and democracy. And surprise, surprise, this Russian anti-Putin activist was also cultivated for years by the US government through CIA cutouts like the NED. Dmitry Muratov is one of the co-founders of a pro-Western anti-Putin newspaper called Novaya Gazeta, which is closely linked to the US government. And in 2014, he participated in an NED-sponsored event that was moderated by the NED, and he participated alongside other US government-funded activists, including an employee of the US state propaganda outlet RFE/RL, which was created by the CIA to destabilize the former Soviet Union, and today it has continued targeting Russia. Now, the NED has given funding and its top awards to numerous writers and activists from this pro-Western Russian media outlet, Novaya Gazeta. So again, the reason that this guy, Dmitry Muratov, won the so-called Nobel Peace Prize is not because he's against war. It's not because he supports peace. It's because he's a pro-Western, pro-US activist who has been serving the foreign policy interests of Western governments and NATO. Speaking of serving the interests of NATO and the US, let's look at the 2022 winners of the so-called Nobel Peace Prize. This was shared by three different individuals or groups. One of the winners that year was the so-called Center for Civil Liberties from Ukraine. This is an anti-Russian, pro-Western, pro-NATO group that, once again, has been sponsored by the CIA cutout, the NED. In 2022, the US government's NED gave the Ukrainian Center for Civil Liberties its so-called Democracy Award. And one of the people who delivered that award to these so-called Nobel Peace Prize winners was the notorious neoconservative pro-war activist Anne Applebaum, a neoconservative American activist who is the opposite of a peace activist. She has strongly supported multiple US wars. But again, the so-called Nobel Peace Prize is not actually about peace. We can see this if we look at the second winner of the so-called Nobel Peace Prize in 2022, which is another anti-Russian, pro-Western group called Memorial, also known as the Memorial Human Rights Center. And the NED announced on its website that Russia's Memorial Human Rights Center was also a grantee of the NED, funded by the CIA cutout. And back in 2004, the NED gave its so-called Democracy Award to the chairman of Memorial. This is yet another US government-backed group. And what's incredible is that this was not the first time that someone from this US government-backed group won the so-called Nobel Peace Prize. Back in 1975, the prize was given to another anti-Russian activist, at that time an anti-Soviet activist, named Andrei Sakharov. He was a so-called dissident who was working with Western governments to try to destabilize and overthrow the former Soviet Union. That's why he won the so-called Nobel Peace Prize, because he was obediently serving US foreign policy interests. But again, like I said, that still isn't all, because in 2022, the so-called Nobel Peace Prize was also given to a third person, which is a Belarusian pro-Western activist named Ales Bialyatsky, who also, yet again, is very closely linked to the CIA cutout, the NED. Now, Ales Bialyatsky was a co-founder of a pro-Western organization called Vyasna, and this is a group that has been supported by Western governments in order to destabilize the independent government of Belarus, which is a close ally of Russia. And in 2014, this Belarusian regime change activist, Ales Bialyatsky, participated in an NED-backed event with the leader of the National Endowment for Democracy, Karl Gershman, the literal head of the CIA cutout, and sitting next to him on stage was the US ambassador to the Czech Republic, Andrew Shapiro. So this so-called Nobel Peace Prize winner had been cultivated by the US government for many years. They didn't even hide it. He was blatantly collaborating with the US government to try to destabilize the independent government in Belarus. So now let's look at the 2023 winner of the so-called Nobel Peace Prize. This was a regime change activist named Narges Mohammadi. And the official website admitted that the award had nothing to do with peace. They didn't even use the word peace. They say that she was given the award because she fights against the oppression of women in Iran and fights to promote human rights and freedom, which is another way of saying that she's a regime change activist who is trying to destabilize the Iranian government and serving US foreign policy interests. And although I've mostly been focusing on the role of the US government in supporting these regime change activists, European governments also have. So Narges Mohammadi, this Nobel laureate, it was part of an organization called the Defenders of Human Rights Center. If you go back in the Wayback Machine to this group's website, you can see that they boast that they were given the Human Rights Prize from the French government. This is an award that the French government gives, very similar to the NED's awards, which is a way of giving money to fund regime change activists in countries being targeted by the West for destabilization. And back in 2003, the so-called Nobel Peace Prize was given to another Iranian regime change activist named Shireen Ebadi. She was the original founder of this Western government-backed group, Defenders of Human Rights Center. And if you look at the official website announcing the so-called Nobel Peace Prize award for this Iranian regime change activist, you see it doesn't even pretend that this award is about peace. Instead, it says that she was given the award because she's fighting for democracy and human rights, which once again just means that she happens to serve Western foreign policy interests. And that year she won the so-called Nobel Peace Prize in 2003. That was also the 20th anniversary of the founding of the CIA cutout, the National Endowment for Democracy. And then US President George W. Bush gave a speech at the US Chamber of Commerce, which was deeply symbolic. You know, this is the main corporate lobby group in Washington. And Bush honored the NED on its 20th birthday. And in this speech, George W. Bush, one of the worst war criminals in modern history, honored Shireen Ebadi, the Iranian regime change activist who founded this Western government-backed so-called human rights group, who was given the so-called Nobel Peace Prize. And Bush used this as an opportunity to call for regime change in Iran. He said, quote, "In Iran, the demand for democracy is strong and broad. The regime in Tehran must heed the democratic demands of the Iranian people or lose its last claim to legitimacy," end quote. And keep in mind that while Bush was giving this speech honoring the so-called Nobel Peace Prize, this was the same year that he was waging war on Iraq. He oversaw an illegal invasion of Iraq, and more than 1 million Iraqis were killed in this illegal US war of aggression. And by the way, that's just scratching the surface of this ridiculous hypocrisy. In fact, in January 2026, the German state media outlet DW invited on this Iranian so-called Nobel Peace Prize winner, Shireen Ebadi, and she openly called for the US to militarily intervene in Iran, to wage war on Iran, to assassinate Iran's political leadership and commanders of Iran's military. So this is the perfect symbol of how the so-called Nobel Peace Prize has nothing to do with peace. It's actually a tool used by the US government to advance its imperialist interests. And in an incredible Orwellian fashion, the so-called Nobel Peace Prize is used by the US empire to justify waging wars abroad in the name of so-called democracy and human rights. Because for the imperialist West, when they say peace, they actually mean so-called democracy and human rights, which is another word of saying imperialism. For them, peace means that Western governments control the entire world in a global imperialist dictatorship led by the United States. That's peace for them. And Iran is a country that has had an independent government ever since its revolution in 1979. And Iran has supported anti-colonialist movements in the global South, resisting Western hegemony, which is why it is targeted by the West for regime change. And this is why the so-called Nobel Peace Prize is given to these Western-backed regime change activists in Iran. And more specifically, the reason that this regime change activist, Narges Mohammadi, was given the so-called Nobel Peace Prize in 2023 is because she played a key role in the so-called women life freedom protests that were aimed at destabilizing the Iranian government, cynically exploiting the oppression of women as an excuse to justify regime change in the interests of the US and Israel and European countries. And the CIA cutout, the NED, has been very proud of the fact, has openly boasted that it has supported some of these women activists in Iran aimed at destabilizing the Iranian government. The NED boasts on its website, quote, during the Women Life Freedom protests, an NED partner published the first report on Mahsa Amini, who became the movement's symbol. Other NED grantees funded by the US government, that is, documented protester deaths, injuries, and arrests, providing critical evidence for international media and human rights investigations. The NED boasted that it's, quote, countering Iran's authoritarian influence. NED grantees have exposed misuse of resources, including Iran's financial support to its regional proxies, and have produced viral media content on Iran's authoritarian influence in the MENA region, end quote. That is Middle East, North Africa region. When they say that, they mean Iran's support for resistance movements fighting against US imperialism and Israeli colonialism, resistance groups in Palestine and Lebanon and Iraq and Syria and Yemen. This is why she was given the so-called Nobel Peace Prize. It had nothing to do with peace. On the contrary, it was in defense of the US-led war against Iran to overthrow Iran's independent government, which has been Washington's obsession ever since the 1979 Iranian Revolution overthrew the Shah, the US-backed puppet dictator who ruled over Iran with an iron fist. And the National Endowment for Democracy has funded many of these regime change operatives in Iran for decades. Now, in recent years, as people learned about the destabilizing impact of the NED, the US government-funded organization removed a lot of information from its website, and it no longer lists the names of organizations that are funded by the NED. But still today, the organization has boasted that it continues to fund regime change operatives in Iran, giving them millions of dollars in the name of fighting for human rights and women's rights and democracy and the rule of law. And by the way, I should point out that there are some people who claim that Trump falsely ended the NED and that Elon Musk, as part of his DOGE, his Department of Government Efficiency, that supposedly he shut down the NED. It's actually not true. The NED has continued operating, and they pointed out in March 2025, they published on their website that the State Department of Marco Rubio gave funding to the NED. So this organization is now being led by Marco Rubio, who has pushed for regime change in Venezuela for decades. He's now overseeing the NED and another CIA cutout, USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development. And by the way, in this press release in March, the NED pointed out that it's funding anti-government groups in Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, China, Russia, and elsewhere. So it's obvious that the NED has been cultivating these coup leaders like Maria Corina Machado and others for decades and continues to do so under Trump and Marco Rubio. All right, now so far in this video, I've talked about how US government-funded operatives seeking regime change in Russia and Belarus and Iran and pro-NATO activists in Ukraine, who have all been funded by the US government, they won the so-called Nobel Peace Prize. I want to also talk about China, because of course China has been a major target for US destabilization for many years. So this is why it's not surprising at all that the so-called Nobel Peace Prize was likewise used to support far-right extremists in China who tried to carry out regime change and carry out coups to destabilize the Chinese government. In 2010, the so-called Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to a far-right US-backed Chinese extremist named Liu Xiaobo. And once again, this is an example of someone who was funded by the US government for many years. The NED boasted on its website back in 2010, although you have to dig for this in the Wayback Machine in the Internet Archive because the NED has since scrubbed this from their website. But back in 2010, this CIA cutout, the NED, boasted that it funded the anti-China organizations that were founded and run by Liu Xiaobo in the name of supporting so-called democracy and human rights in China, which is another way of saying destabilizing the independent socialist government of the People's Republic of China in order to serve US foreign policy interests. That's why he won the so-called Nobel Peace Prize. And then in 2014, the NED gave another award to this US government-funded anti-China activist Liu Xiaobo. And the ceremony for this award featured a top official from the US State Department, the US Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, Tom Malinowski. By the way, before this guy Malinowski became a top US State Department official, he was the Washington director for the organization Human Rights Watch, which shows how the so-called human rights organizations have a revolving door with the US government, and they're not actually about human rights. They're about serving the interests of the US empire, serving US foreign policy interests, and serving the interests of US corporations by cynically exploiting the rhetoric of human rights and democracy. But in fact, in many ways, they're violating human rights and democracy in order to expand the power of the US empire. But anyway, going back to this NED award for this anti-China activist who won the so-called Nobel Peace Prize, of course, the CIA cutout, the NED, gave this award to Liu Xiaobo on the 25th anniversary of the failed color revolution in Tiananmen Square in 1989. And the NED has proudly admitted that it supported many of the regime change operatives who participated in this failed color revolution in Tiananmen Square in 1989. If you go to the NED website, again, this is a CIA cutout backed by the US government, they say very clearly, quote, "The National Endowment for Democracy, NED, is proud to have long supported many of these efforts as part of our mission to advance and strengthen democratic values and institutions. Since 1984, NED has supported efforts to promote democratic values and institutions in China," end quote. So this is the US government boasting that it has funded these regime change operatives aimed at destabilizing and overthrowing the independent government of China. And this is the real reason why US-backed operatives like Liu Xiaobo were given the so-called Nobel Peace Prize. It has nothing to do with peace. And in fact, there was a very good article published in The Guardian in 2010, right after he won this award, that exposed how Liu was a complete US puppet who was literally funded by the US government and who literally supported Western colonialism. I'm not exaggerating. They pointed out that the so-called Chinese dissident, the West loves these so-called dissidents who happen to be funded by the West. They pointed out that he was a champion of war, not peace. This Chinese dissident endorsed the US illegal invasion of Iraq and the invasion of Afghanistan. He also applauded the US wars in Vietnam and Korea that killed millions of people. So this winner of the so-called Nobel Peace Prize, who was given this award after being funded by the US government because he tried to destabilize the Chinese government, he literally supported US wars that killed millions of people, and yet he won the so-called Nobel Peace Prize. It is a complete farce. But not just that, he also strongly supported Israel. We see a trend here where the winners of the so-called Nobel Peace Prize support US-Israeli wars against the Palestinian people. They don't want peace for Palestinians. In fact, they blame everything on the Palestinians. And as if that weren't already crazy enough, honestly, it's not that surprising. He's just the Chinese version of Maria Corina Machado. But this so-called Chinese dissident took it a step further. Liu advocated the total westernization of China. He stated that, quote, to choose westernization is to choose to be human, end quote. And he literally supported colonization. This is a quote from this winner of the so-called Nobel Peace Prize. He said, quote, it took Hong Kong 100 years to become what it is. Given the size of China, certainly it would need 300 years of colonization for it to become like what Hong Kong is today. I even doubt whether 300 years would be enough, end quote. So he literally called for hundreds of years of colonization of China to turn it into a Western colony. This is how you win a so-called Nobel Peace Prize, is you have to be a US government-funded puppet who supports wars that kill millions of people and who calls for the colonization of your country. This is the true face of the so-called Nobel Peace Prize. And just like the Chinese version of this Chinese fascist, Maria Corina Machado, just like how she called for the mass privatization of everything in Venezuela, would it surprise you to learn that this Chinese so-called dissident, Liu, who was funded by the US government and won the so-called Nobel Peace Prize, he called for the total privatization of all state-owned enterprises in China and the privatization of all land in China. So everything in China could be sold off to US corporations and Western oligarchs, which is exactly what happened to the former Soviet Union, to Russia in the 1990s. And of course, Liu Xiaobo was funded by the CIA, cut out the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, just like Maria Corina Machado and the far-right opposition in Venezuela have been funded for decades by the CIA, cut out the NED. And these authors pointed out in this article in The Guardian that this is actually not new in terms of the history of the Nobel Peace Prize. Another winner of the so-called Nobel Peace Prize was the anti-Soviet so-called dissident, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And just like these far-right extremists in Venezuela and China and Russia and Belarus and Iran and on, Solzhenitsyn was basically a fascist. He strongly supported Spain's fascist dictator, Francisco Franco. He wanted to return to a fascist kind of czarist regime in Russia. He wanted to overthrow the Soviet Union. And he criticized the US for not killing enough people in Vietnam, for only killing 3 million Vietnamese. He wanted to kill all Vietnamese. I mean, these are the fascists who win so-called Nobel Peace Prizes because they are complete puppets of the West. They are pro-Western fascists. That's why they win this absurd farce of a so-called peace prize. And the last thing that I'll say today is a nice historical anecdote. The revolutionary socialist French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, he was offered a Nobel Prize in 1964, but he understood that the Nobel Prize was a Western tool of imperialism and capitalism used to colonize the global South and spread the interest of Western capital, of Western large corporations and Wall Street. And this is why Jean-Paul Sartre famously said, quote, in the present situation, the Nobel Prize stands objectively as a distinction reserved for the writers of the West or the rebels of the East, end quote. And the situation has not changed in the past 6 decades. It's exactly the same today. And the perfect example of this is the far-right US government-funded extremist in Venezuela, Maria Corina Machado. Another clear example is in 1989, the Nobel Peace Prize was given to the Dalai Lama who is a longtime CIA-backed US government asset. The Associated Press reported in 1998 that the CIA funded the Dalai Lama and Tibetan separatist groups in order to undermine China. I'm reading here an AP Newswire that was published by the New York Times. Quote, the Dalai Lama's administration acknowledged today that it received $1.7 million a year in the 1960s from the Central Intelligence Agency. The money allocated for the resistance movement was spent on training volunteers and paving for guerrilla operations against the Chinese. The decade-long covert program to support the Tibetan independence movement was part of the CIA's worldwide effort to undermine communist governments, particularly in the Soviet Union and China. So in 1989, the Nobel Peace Prize was given to this CIA asset who was being used by the US government to wage war against the People's Republic of China, to overthrow China's government, to destabilize it. Just like today, in 2025, the Nobel Peace Prize was given to another US government asset, Maria Corina Machado, who has been funded by the US government for decades to destabilize and overthrow Venezuela's independent government. This is why the renowned political scientist and historian Michael Parenti referred to it as the Nobel Peace Prize for War, because it has always been deeply hypocritical and it has been an instrument used by the US government as part of its foreign policy. Parenti did point out that there have been a small handful of heroes that did deserve the Nobel Peace Prize, like Martin Luther King Jr., like Nelson Mandela, but they are the exception that proves the rule. The vast majority of the time, the Nobel Peace Prize is corrupt and it is a tool of interventionism that is ironically used to justify more US wars and violence, not peace. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of
Bose, my good friend and my go-to, frankly, for what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, to which we will turn in a minute, I promise you, is a master of the political arts. Literally so. He's an MA in politics, but he's an even better commentator. And he's very seldom wrong. And he joins me now from, I presume, Moscow. Che, great to see you again. I'd like to start with the developments in the sphere of extraterrestrial alien life. Maybe we'll have time to get to that. But before that, we must talk about the alien life assembled without Arctic camouflage. Talk about sitting penguins in Greenland. The expeditionary force of Starmer, Macron, and Meloni. You couldn't make this up, could you, Che?
Just listening to your masterful introduction there and your monologue, it's always just great. I mean, look, one word came to mind, and it's this German word. And I suggest everybody get on Google now, not while the show's on, as soon as it's finished, and look up the term Schadenfreude. And Schadenfreude is, I think, the sense which many people on our side of the political divide and the sort of the divide between what's been happening, this war machine, this terrible hegemonous machine that has, you know, littered corpses across the globe in the post-war period, the post-Second World War period, as it massacred the continents, Africa, Asia, from Vietnam, Korea, and the silence of the sort of supplicant European countries as this brutal machine sort of did its business has been deafening. And we've seen it most recently in Ukraine, of course, a Nazi supporting regime, grossly corrupt, people like you, people like Guy, who have come out to tell the truth about Ukraine, vilified, marginalized, arrested, denied our rights, our privileges, attacked at every end. And suddenly we see that this tiger, which the Europeans very sort of aggressively in some ways thought that they were superior to as well. There's a sense of this European superiority when it came to America. You know, they were great for security, great for the muscle. You know, the big dumb American cousin was going to keep the Russians away. And we now see that this perceived Russian threat. I mean, we were told in the 1970s perpetually, consistently, that the Russians were going to invade Europe. Well, the Russians were saying, look, the Europeans will do a very good job at destroying themselves. We probably don't need to do anything at all. The capitalist systems that have, you know, delivered us here, if you like, are so corrupt and so focused on profit that there's probably not a lot we need to do to sit back. Now, of course, the Europeans and their American masters were very good at undermining the Soviet project. It collapsed. And a lot of the geostrategic and geopolitical issues we have now on the continent of Europe are, you know, remnants of that delusional attitude. But right in the midst of all this now, it's quite remarkable to watch these headless chickens rushing around. I read today that Mr. Macron announced that the European Union would use a bazooka of essential sanctions, but they are actually, in fact, tariffs against the United States, the anti-coercion instrument, which is a draconian set of laws that the Europeans hold in reserve to prevent themselves being coerced into any sort of issue globally. And that's going to be deployed potentially against the United States of America. I also wrote recently that the European Union were compiling a significant list of sanctions and countermeasures against the United States. And there was a bit of kickback against that online, saying, oh, no, that's not the case. What is your source? Of course, I have sources who talk to me, people in the European Parliament who are on these committees, which are trying to get ahead of this remarkable situation where a dog that the Europeans always believed intellectually they had on a leash has broken from that leash now and is gnawing away at a significant territory, which is the fiefdom, if you like. Because remember, George, if you look, and I wrote about this as well, if you look at the history of Greenland, the history of the abuse of the indigenous Inuit people by the Danes, right up until the 1980s, the Danish authorities were forcibly sterilizing young girls as young as 11 and 12 years of age, Inuit children. The people there were pushed into local industry. Their history and their culture was completely ground into dust for the crown. Remember, this is a royal country. This is the Danish monarchy. Remember as well. And as an Irishman, and you as a Scotsman, I don't think we're great monarchists. And the remarkable sense for me right now is one of Schadenfreude, seeing this empire which propped itself up, the Europeans always with this faux sense of outrage and liberalism, the anti-war movement, which was completely decayed in Europe on the left, whereas now we see only an anti-war movement in Ukraine, particularly on the right, remarkably. To see them now charging about in the halls of power in Europe, wondering how they're going to pull the American, this Leviathan, this economic, military Leviathan back into line. That's the sense right now in Europe. And of course, in Moscow, in Beijing, yet again, those two great countries get to sit back and watch this machine essentially pull itself apart. It's quite remarkable.
Well, this comedian, Callas, who is our foreign minister, though we, of course, never elected her any more than we elected any of these panjandrums in the European Union, she at least got one thing right in her hopefully brief tenure as foreign minister. She said they are laughing in Moscow and in Beijing. And Schadenfreude, that wonderful German word, is, of course, entirely apt. Not that the Europeans are entirely without weapons to fire back. It turns out that Ozempic 100% of Ozempic entering the United States comes from Denmark. And the Danes are warning as severely as they can to Mike Pompeo and all the others in the Washington class who are half the men they used to be. Thanks to Denmark and Ozempic, it's going to be stopped. They're not going to allow any more Ozempic to reach the shores of the United States. Maybe Danish bacon, maybe French fries or freedom fries, we might rename them, will be stopped. But this joke, Dad's Army, it's actually funnier than Dad's Army, of the expeditionary force that's been sent. Now we learn from Bild, the 15 Germans in the joke are no longer, they have been recalled. They're not going to fight, are they? They're going to, as the Russian statesman Medvedev said, they're going to shit their pants and surrender. That's obvious, isn't it?
Look, I mean, it's hard to keep a straight face while you watch this happening. It's akin to having these neighbors who are, you know, the people first into church on a Sunday, you know, kids who do so well in school, never, you know, raise a voice on a New Year's Eve, and suddenly you see them beating each other up in the front garden. It's hard to take your eyes off this as it occurs. And I've been watching it very closely, particularly the attempts at harmony. The European Union sort of issued a joint statement. Antonio Costa, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, the usual stock drivel. We stand with Greenland and its people. We stand with the people of Denmark. Now, of course, they didn't stand with the indigenous people of Denmark. They don't stand with the people of Crimea, for example, who voted for autonomy from Ukraine. They don't stand with the people of Donbass, Donetsk. They don't stand with the Serbs, whose territory was carved up, as you say, and stolen from them to make an outpost within the heartland of the Serbian people, theft of the territory. They didn't stand with the people in Yugoslavia when their energy systems were bombed, destroyed, attacked, targeted, water treatment plants. And they don't stand with the people of Ukraine today as they're dragged from the street and sent to die in a perpetually failing proxy war. So what I see as the reality of where we are right now is the management of this collapse. How are they going to try to reverse themselves into some sort of plausible position? Regarding the deployment of the troops, George, I mean, whoever thought that this could possibly be a good idea, it reminded me of Winston Churchill. You know, the lack of statesmen. Whatever you think of Churchill, he was a great leader for Britain during the Second World War. The abject lack of statesmanship and the lack of people to step up to the plate now, while the European Union and NATO face their greatest challenges since their inception, is really remarkable to see. It's conspicuous by its absence. And as you mentioned, Kaja Kallas, this essentially diversity hire from the Minnow state of Estonia, who only knows how to hate Russia. That's the only reason she ever got her job, was because she hated Russia so much, despite being the daughter of the Soviet elite, and despite the fact that her husband made millions after the Russian intervention in 2022 with his transport company until he was caught by a newspaper. These people are completely vacuous morally, and when it comes to the crunch, they have nothing to say. You would imagine that if they were serious about the territorial integrity of Greenland or Denmark, they would immediately have done what Margaret Thatcher did in 1982, correct me if I'm wrong, and dispatch a large-scale force halfway around the globe, as Margaret Thatcher did. And again, as an Irishman, I have no particular graw or love for Margaret Thatcher. You, as a man who defended the miners, will not either. But regardless of that, we have to try and be objective. She was a leader who was true to her word. She was advised not to do it, but she dispatched this force. The Europeans have sent less than 20 men each, 15 of which have scurried away under the cover of night to come back as soon as Mr. Merz was faced with the reality of $15 billion a year in sanctions from the United States of America. It's quite remarkable. And as we say, only in the crucible and the furnace of these really difficult situations do people come to the fore? Maybe we should put people like Robert Fico and Viktor Orban at the head of the negotiation here, because the reality is, and the dogs on the street know in Europe, in NATO HQ, and everywhere else, that if Donald Trump wants Greenland, he's having Greenland, whether he buys it, seizes it, or takes it through economic subjugation or blockade. And again, this is something that the United States has been doing since the end of the Second World War globally. And I've written this recently too, and this is important in my view. What we're seeing now is the empire of Trump. We're seeing the United States overtly do what it's covertly been doing for decades, George, as you well know, and many of our viewers will know. Operation Condor in South America, the overt and covert operations in the Middle East, the destruction of Iranian democracy, very current now, Mohammad Mosaddegh's government destroyed in 1953. This playbook has been going on, but it's been conveniently done covertly. So the European elites who've coalesced with the American empire have been able to pretend it wasn't happening. But now they are on the menu. They're not at the table anymore. They're on the menu. They're on the platter, about to be consumed by this monstrous creation, which is unable to be brought to heel. The Europeans have hollowed themselves out. They economically, militarily, and politically. There is no leadership with which to stand up that anybody of the ilk of Donald Trump would consider or listen to. He doesn't respect the Europeans. And that's why he feels he can bite the biggest chunk of its territory off and stand there and say, what are you going to do about it? And the reality is they're going to do nothing.
It's tragicomic, because this European continent was the king of the road. First the Portuguese, then the Spanish, then of course preeminently the British, but with some also Rands, with a colony or 2 or 5 or 10, but also Rands. This European hegemony, which dominated the world for 500 years, is now crashing and burning in ruins. Their own metropolitan heartlands are a husk, a shadow of their former selves, unrecognizable as their former selves, their economies crashing and burning. And yet we're asked to believe that Russia wants to end the war in Ukraine, America wants to end the war in Ukraine, but it cannot be allowed to end because of this Europe that is burning, literally as well as metaphorically. What does all this mean for the end of the conflict and the end of the agony of the peoples of the Ukraine?
Yeah, and of course, everything is linked on this global chessboard. Everything is linked. And what this really shows us is the lack of sincerity in any, when it comes to any sort of positioning of the European Union, the lack of unity, the lack of sincerity in their desire to end the conflict in Ukraine, a conflict that they were hyper aggressive in cultivating, propagating, and igniting, of course, along with their American counterparts, to the biggest part in the Maidan. Now, that civil war has rolled on, but now, of course, we see that this sort of obfuscation by Europe about even sending peacekeeping forces. We've seen this. Now we see what happens in Denmark when territory is actually about to be seized. They've sent less than 20 men apiece. The reality that Ukraine has been used as a somewhat willing patsy in its own country to try to inflict what is widely known as a desired strategic defeat on Russia. The RAND Corporation wrote the rule book about this. They told us exactly what they were going to do, how to unbalance Russia via Ukraine. We've known this since the Second World War. So what does it mean for Ukraine, what we see happening now? What it means is it obviously, in my view, emboldens Russia somewhat to the point where it reinforces the reality that Russia doesn't and shouldn't need to seek the permission of the European Union, which has demonstrated itself now beyond any sort of doubt as an utterly morally vacuous talking shop, which is only really concerned with the pensions of its unelected bureaucracy. It's also become an a la carte authority on things like the brutal treatment of the Ukrainian people by the dictatorship, which is Mr. Zelensky's unelected government. We've seen the gross corruption, the golden toilet. Today, I read Ukrainian journalist Diana Panchenko writing about the head of the SBU, the secret police. They're stealing $10 million a month. An ex-colleague of Mr. Zelensky's from his Kvartal 95 production company. This stuff is flushing out of Ukraine daily. Meanwhile, the ski slopes of Ukraine are full of the elites of this grotesque elites from this country stealing billions of dollars of hard-working European and American workers' money. It's absolutely grotesque. So I don't see how anybody now, even the most radical anti-Russian, could suggest that the Europeans have any moral authority remaining. And to me, this is a significant hollowing out and a quickening, if you like, of the collapse of the European Union and of NATO, something that I predicted. None of these empires can persist indefinitely. And certainly an empire that won't defend its borders, George, refuses to defend its borders, is certainly doomed. As we saw with Margaret Thatcher, as I say, she dispatched this armada, whether you agree with her politically or not, the will for anybody in Europe to demonstrate, or in NATO indeed, to demonstrate that they're serious and to make Donald Trump think seriously about a stone in his shoe is completely absent. It's a vacuum. And inside that vacuum is a mirror. And the mirror tells us that everything that they've said to us about Yugoslavia, about Russia, about China, about the threat from abroad, the threat from outside, this garden that they're outside the European Union is a jungle, when they've created a jungle within Europe, where they vilified people like Orban, like Fico, like Babiš in the Czech Republic. This is the reality that we're seeing now. And many of us, me included, are enjoying it to some extent, the vindication of the reality that the European Union only ever talked a great game. It was never going to actually be serious about the defending the rights of anybody, least of all the frozen wastes of Greenland, which we know will, as a matter of course now, become American.
A bit of a pickle, and you're not going to believe what's happening. Europe is reaching out to Russia. Europe is engaging Russia and seeming to say, we need Russia. We need Russia back in the community of nations of Europe. I mean, Friedrich Merz has come out and said it. He's basically saying that Russia is the largest European nation and Europe needs Russia. This is the same guy who was trying to convince Zelensky to use long-range missiles to attack Russia. This is the same guy who just, I guess, a month ago was talking about rebuilding Germany's military so he can prepare for war with Russia. Now he's saying, no, sorry, I changed my mind. I want to engage Russia. I want to meet with Putin, and I want Russia to come back. Baby, come back. Isn't that the song? Oh my God. Wait, there's more. It's not only Germany, it's also Italy. It's also, who am I missing here? France. Macron is signaling the same thing, and Finland. I mean, the only one that's still on the outskis is the UK. But so if you're asking me what's happening, yes, it has a lot to do with, well, with everything, with the Oreshnik missile, with the fact that the Russians are kicking the shit out of the Ukrainians, the fact that Europeans know that but have never wanted to say it, the fact that Trump recognized it early and then met with Putin and the Europeans were left out on the lurch. All of these things, of course, the latest is the most important, kidnapping of Maduro, and then the threat of taking Greenland. And now the latest, as you probably know, just today, is the fact that Trump is going to hit these European countries with a 10% tariff for not allowing him to just do what he wants, which is take Greenland, because he wants Greenland's rare earth minerals and trade routes and potential oil off of their coast. This is amazing. So let me tell you here's what's happening. I know a little bit about investing. I'm not the foremost expert by any stretch of the imagination, but there's something in the investment world called a short squeeze. So a short squeeze is basically when you as an investor decide that you're going to bet against a company, right? And that's usually what they do. They try to short the company. And to do so, they leverage themselves by going to their friend, their bank, whatever, and they borrow money, planning that this company is going to go down. When this company goes down, they're going to get rich, but they're leveraged, right? That's exactly what's happening right now with Europe. Europe is in a short squeeze. They're screwed. I mean, the EU is fractured. So is NATO. They're broke. They've spent all their money. And they were betting on Russia collapsing. Russia looks as strong as ever. It's not collapsing. And Europe's, bank, if you will, is the United States. And the United States is saying to Europe, we're done with you. You can't even pay your bills. We're done with you. We can't support you anymore. So they're in a short squeeze. They're in the typical short squeeze. Their banker, their lender, their benefactor is telling them, fuck you. That's essentially what Trump is saying to Europe right now. I'm going to take your land. You can't do anything about it. Oh, and I'm going to hit you with tariffs. Russia, meanwhile, is saying to the Europeans for the longest time, by the way, I want to deal with you guys. I want to be a part of NATO. Why don't you just make me a part of your world, right? And the Europeans have been saying, no, screw you. We don't want to have anything to do with you. We're going to attack you. We want a war with you. We're going to give more money to Ukraine so they can't attack you. Finally, Russia recently said, look, we don't want to go to war with you, but if this is what you want, this is what you'll get. And then Putin sent the Oreshnik missile. Signal sent. So this is where we are right now. Europe is in a short squeeze situation. They have to choose. The United States is telling them, we don't want anything to do with you. They can't really turn to China because they've already created that situation with China where there is no path to any kind of friendship there. Not really, right? So, and most importantly, they need to stay within their continent. So that's why they're saying it's about bringing Russia back on board. They're not doing it because they want to. They're doing it because they have to. They're doing it because they have to. And this latest thing with the tariffs on Greenland pushes them there even further. The question now is, what's Russia going to do? Russia's always been saying, we just want to be a part of Europe. It's what we've always been. But of course, Europe has kicked them in the teeth. So Russia's turned elsewhere. Europe now has a fledgling relationship with Trump and the United States. Russia has an amazing relationship with China and India. So it's not like they're going to give themselves exclusively to the Europeans. But Putin is saying, yeah, we'll talk. But we're talking on my terms this time, not your terms. This is a fascinating time to be following the news. Stay with me. I'll let you know what's going on. I'm Rick Sanchez.
MI6 and Mossad bungle the effort to create a 1953 style coup in Iran, or did the Iranian intelligence outsmart them, or both?
I think it's a combination of the two. Look, the Iranians know and have known for some time that the hostile intelligence services have been seeking to exploit the fractures that exist in Iranian society, mainly ethnic fractures. You have Azeris in the north, you have the Kurds, you have Arabs, you have the Baluch, you have also ideological, the MEK, the monarchists. There's significant fractures inside Iran, that the Islamic Revolution has been struggling against and struggling to overcome since 1979. And the intelligence services are aware of these fractures and they seek to exploit them. They until the most recent events, the most dangerous effort took place in the summer of 2023. I remember talking to President Raisi in September of 2023, where he said that, the struggle that Iran went through was the most dangerous struggle since the revolution, that, the intelligence services, had made deep inroads and had created, an environment where people were questioning the legitimacy of the theocracy. But the struggle actually allowed the Iranians to unite. I think the majority of Iranians recognize that Iran is better off with a government of its own making, however imperfect it is, than they are about having foreign entities impose a government on them. And the Raisi said that Iran was stronger. The current Iranian president, Pezeshkian, I met in September of last year, and he said the similar thing. So the Iranians knew this was here. These intelligence services have been very successful over the years in recruiting people and having them deeply in bed inside Iran. We saw that with the whole drone operation that took place during the 12-day war, where suddenly secret drone factories emerged out of nowhere, and these cars were driving around launching drones. This happened right under the nose of the Iranian government. Now, the Iranian government was able to roll up this network, but the implication was, and the former Mossad director Cohen hinted, he said, "We've got more up our sleeve." I think this was it. The international foreign intelligence services orchestrated a monetary crisis, a collapse of confidence in the Iranian crisis that led to legitimate demonstrations in the street. And for 2 days, the Iranians went to the street peacefully, and the Iranian government let them demonstrate. And then on the third day, these cells were activated. And this is where the violence began. The idea was to generate so much violence that they hijacked that the regime would be compelled to respond. And then the orchestrators would be able to hijack this. And at the same time, there would be airstrikes that would suppress the government's ability to react. And this would allow a revolution to take place. And they got almost to that point. The problem was the Iranian government nipped it in the bud sooner than they were supposed to because of effective intelligence. The Mossad and MI6 and the CIA made extensive use of Starlink as a mechanism of communication. Why? Because it's outside of the Iranian internet infrastructure. The Iranians have put in a kill switch and have had a kill switch for some time in their internet where they could shut it down to fight the ability of these foreign-backed entities to communicate internally. And so to overcome that, and this is something that happened in the summer of 2023, is that the Iranians were very effective in shutting down these cells because they could control the internet connectivity inside Iran. So Starlink was supposed to solve this problem. The trouble was that these same intelligence services have been using Starlink to extensively in Ukraine. Use it to guide drones, use it to communicate, to create communications on the front lines. When the Ukrainians went into Kursk in August of 2024, the connectivity they had, the real-time connectivity, was all powered through Starlink. And the Russians were quick I remember talking to Abdi Aladinov about this, and the Russians learned that Starlink was a problem. So the Russians developed two unique capabilities. One is to track Starlink at its source and at its destination, meaning that if you use Starlink, the Russians are able to tell, what the point-to-point connectivity is and where it is geographically. And then the second thing is to shut it down. They have a kill switch. They can knock it out. That's how they drop drones, because these drones are using Starlink and the Russians just kill it. They provided this technology to the Iranians, and the Iranians used it to good effect. They were able to monitor real-time the communications being received by these Mossad, MI6, CIA operatives from their controllers overseas. Not only were they made aware of the orders being given, but who was receiving the orders and where they were located. And then what they did is they went in and they rolled them up and they shut it down. And now the Mossad and MI6 and the CIA, they can't talk to anybody. This is why you saw this huge thing. Why are the Iranians shutting down? If they say they're not murdering these people, why are they keeping the internet shut down? Well, they're keeping the internet shut down because they don't want the CIA, the Mossad, everybody else to communicate with what's left. They're trying to left. And very effective. Last gas desperation, the Israelis sent huge packages of Starlink upgrades because maybe they thought, maybe there was a glitch. So let's send them new Starlink modules. And the Iranians were monitoring that, and they rolled it up and they captured it all. And because of this, they shut it down too soon, and the airstrikes didn't happen. And so there was a gap, and that's why they ended up not launching the airstrikes, because the airstrikes were no longer linked to activities on the ground and would be ineffective.
You used an interesting phrase early on in the explanation you just gave us, a government of their own making, which is obvious what exists in Iran. 2 weeks after he abducted, using extraordinary military force to do so, President Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, President Trump said he wants the Ayatollahs and the theocracy out. By what legal authority or diplomatic precedent or moral value can one head of state demand and facilitate the removal of another head of state when the second state poses no threat whatsoever to the state of the person doing the demanding? Is Trump competent to make these demands?
Apparently, according to Donald Trump, because he has moral convictions and he only uses those moral convictions to guide him. That's all what he needs. But your question is, what legal foundation? There's no legal foundation. Again, I mean, you know the Constitution far better than I, and I'm just a simple Marine. But the Constitution that we took an oath to uphold and defend allows for, when the United States enters a treaty that's been signed by the president, ratified by 2/3 of the United States Senate, that treaty becomes the supreme law of the land. And the United Nations Charter falls within that category. So for all the Americans out there who belittle the charter, say it doesn't matter, you're saying the Constitution doesn't matter. You literally are saying that. And that's what the president has said, that international law doesn't matter. He takes no guidance from international law. And this isn't just the charter. This is the Geneva Conventions. This is everything that makes civilized society globally civilized. And the president has walked away from that. Look, the Iranians aren't perfect. They'll be the first ones to tell you. I mean, I remember President Pezeshkian saying just that. We have problems, he said. But he brought up something interesting. He said in 2023, one of the major issues we had was that the women of Iran were frustrated with the fact that they had to wear the hijab, that they felt so constrained. Today in Iran, the women don't wear the hijab if they don't want to wear the hijab. If you go to northern Tehran to the shopping center, you'll think that you're in Los Angeles because the hair is undone, flowing. Midriffs are showing. I mean, the idea of an Iranian woman showing her belly in public was unheard of even a year ago. Today, it's not totally common. It's there. You see the why? Because the Iranian government is a democratically elected government that listens to the will of the people when the will of the people is legally expressed. And the Iranian people said, we don't want your hijab laws. The women, who constitute over 51% of the population, said, if we want to wear the hijab, we'll wear the hijab. If we don't, You can't make us. And the Iranian government said, we agree with you. Come on, guys, that is cause and effect democracy in
All right.
action.
So what remains of international law if Donald J. Trump can say, I want the Ayatollah out, just like I wanted Maduro out?
Nothing, because and we can see this now. We see other nations that previously embraced the rule of law. Russia, in fact, we now have people in Russia of note, not in the government yet, but people who advise the government or close to the government, saying it's time for Russia to start playing by the law of the jungle as well, because they feel that the United States gains too much advantage going out there and not paying any price. They say maybe it's time for Russia. And if China and Russia decide that international law no longer matters, we are in the jungle, and then it becomes might makes right. And I have to tell Americans again, just keep in mind who the president's been beating up on lately: Venezuela, Greenland. Who did he back away from? Iran. Why? Because they were going to kick his butt, and he knows it. Russia, he backs away from. The president, we don't have the strength that everybody thinks we have. We have limited strength. And the president right now is very good at bullying people who can't fight back. But if we want to enter the law of the jungle, then Shere Khan, the big tiger, you got to take on Shere Khan. And we can't take on Shere Khan right now.
Here's President Putin speaking remarkably similar to what you just said last Thursday, January 15th, about promises made and promises unkept. Chris, cut number 1.
80 years ago, our fathers and grandfathers, great-grandfathers, having won the Second World War, were able to unite, find a balance of interests, and agree on the fundamental rules and principles of international relations, and enshrine them in the UN Charter in all their totality, completeness, and interconnection. The imperatives of this foundational document, such as equality, respect for sovereignty, non-interference in internal affairs, and the resolution of disputes through dialogue, are now in demand more than ever. This principle is enshrined in fundamental international legal documents. Disregard for this basic, vital principle has never led and will never lead to anything good. This was clearly demonstrated by the crisis around Ukraine, which became a direct consequence of many years of ignoring Russia's legitimate interests and a deliberate course toward creating threats to our security, toward the advance of the NATO bloc to Russia's borders, contrary to the public promises given to us. I want to emphasize this. Contrary to the public promises given to us, I recall that Russia has repeatedly put forward initiatives to build a new, reliable, and fair architecture of European and global security.
I want to re-emphasize this. Contrary to the public promises given to us, we all know exactly what he's talking about. Is it time to reconsider the Cold War? Or the Cold War mentality? Let me refine the question.
Well, the Cold War mentality. First of all, the Cold War was created on an absolute misunderstanding. The United States and the Soviet Union were allies at the end of the Second World War. There was some frustration at Potsdam about what Russia was doing in Poland, but the reality is Russia was only doing that which was agreed to in Poland, and it was just the fact that he outgamed Winston Churchill that created this issue. The United States at the end of the Second World War was seeking to impose American economic hegemony on the world. The Marshall Plan, we had created the World Bank, we had the International Monetary Fund, and we were trying to strong-arm Joseph Stalin in Russia into joining these so that the Soviet reconstruction, which was extensive, would fall under the umbrella of the Marshall Plan and Marshall Plan-like things. And that would give the United States the ability to control indirectly the Soviet Union, because we would control indirectly their economy. And Stalin said no. And so the Department of Treasury had sent an inquiry to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in January of 1946. And in February, George Kennan responded with this famous 8,000-word long telegram. And his response went beyond simply asking the question, why didn't the Soviets want to join the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund? And instead, he went into an expose on the incompatibility of the Soviet Union and its way of thinking and its approach to the West. This was used by the Truman administration to create the Truman Doctrine, which was, if the Soviets don't want to play on our team, then we need to contain them. We need to isolate them. We need to stop their expansion, even though there was no expansion taking place. And then this got weaponized into what was known as NSC 68 in 1950, which created the concept of the Cold War, that we would now use military force to contain the Soviet Union. And then we had the Cold War from 1950 until 1991, the Cold War. And yes, it was a dangerous time. We had arms races, we had, threats of nuclear war, but we never had a hot war. We avoided a hot war. And the other interesting thing about the Cold War is the entire time we had sound diplomatic relations. I just want to point out that during the time of Joe Biden, we weren't even talking to the Russians. We had diplomatic relations. I knew the Russian ambassador Anatoly Antonov very well, and his frustration about not having interaction with the U.S. government, with the State Department, which is basically sitting in Washington, D.C., it was palpable. During the Cold War, we always had diplomatic relations with the Soviets. We had economic relations with the Soviets. We had tourism. Nikita Khrushchev visited the United States. Richard Nixon visited the Soviet Union. We had summits where we talked with one another. We came into agreements. And because we respected each other, we entered into binding international agreements regarding arms control. First, to limit arms control, the strategic arms limitations, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, but then eventually to eliminate the weapons themselves, to the INF treaty that I played a role in, the START treaty I played a role in the beginning. These were treaties that were premised on mutual respect. We had foreign area officers in the military and foreign service officers in the State Department who were genuine experts on the Soviet Union, on Russia, not because we loved them. Heck, we were in a Cold War, but because we needed to know the whole truth and nothing but the truth about these people that we were ideologically up against. And so the officers that I dealt with, the colonels, lieutenant colonels that I dealt with on our side when we were doing the arms control treaty, these were genuine experts. They knew Russia. They could speak the Russian language. They knew Russian history. They knew Russian culture. They were able to go to Russia and integrate effectively. They could hear the Russians bring back that message, articulate it effectively so that we had sound policy. That was the Cold War. You compare and contrast that with what we have today. Russophobia running rampant. We can't even study. My daughter went to Georgetown University. Okay, she studied in the elite foreign service program. She was specializing in the Caucasus region, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Chechnya, Dagestan. And I took her to Russia. And I took her to Chechnya, and she met Ramzan Kadyrov. She met the senior leadership of the Chechen Republic. She had informed discussions with these people. She learned so much. She toured museums. She talked to senior imams, senior historians. When she came back to Georgetown, this girl who was getting her master's degree in Caucasian studies was mocked. Her fellow students, many of them who were taking programs related to how to overthrow the government in Georgia and all that. Some of them posted she should commit suicide. They demanded she be kicked out of the program, and the school chastised her. Okay, that's the state of American academia today. There's no desire to have genuine knowledge about Russia, about anything about Russia. They promote anti-Putin ideology. It's Russophobia all over again. We were healthier academically during the Cold War than we are today. And the other problem now, too, is where are we going? During the Cold War, it was about learning to peacefully coexist with the Soviet Union. That's what it was all about. Even Ronald Reagan, the great Cold Warrior, when he started his presidency, it was the evil empire. But by the time he finished, when he was at University of Moscow, and a student said, "Are we still the evil empire?" He said, "No, times have changed. I view you as friends. I view you as friends," and he meant it. But we didn't follow through. Why? Because the Cold War ended. and it ended in a way that allowed us to say, we won, you lost. That's really not true. You know, the mythology of we went into an arms race and we bankrupted the Soviet Union. The people that embrace that know nothing about how the Soviet economy worked, how Soviet defense industry worked. The Soviet Union failed because Mikhail Gorbachev mismanaged his perestroika revolution. And he basically broke the system and had nothing to replace it, and it collapsed. But we didn't reach out a helping hand to say, hey, let me help you up, friend. We put our foot on their neck and we said, you're staying down. And the decade of the 90s was all about the United States keeping Russia down, keeping Russia weak, trying to break Russia up to end Russia's ability to rise up and challenge us again like they did during the Soviet Union. That's the truth. That's the legacy of the Cold War, a failed relationship. And when Vladimir Putin came out in 2000 and said, nah, we're standing up, we're dusting ourselves off, and we're going to be the equals. We're going to be, he taught Russians to fall in love with Russia again, to be proud of Russia. And he said, we will not be kneeling before anybody. We're not trying to be above you, but we're certainly not going to kneel. All of the Cold Warriors who won the Cold War for the United States resented that. They've resented Vladimir Putin, and they've been seeking to remove him from power ever since. And the hatred for Vladimir Putin, because Vladimir Putin refuses to yield, has led to the situation we are today. We have a situation where the President of the United States tried to kill Vladimir Putin on December 29th. We need to go back to the Cold War. Why? Because, first of all, we have to learn to respect Russia again. Second of all, by having an adversarial relationship with Russia, we will be compelled to learn the reality of Russia, just like we did in the past, to re-educate ourselves about the truth about Russia. And then once we learn to respect Russia, let's end the Cold War the right way, with two equal powers, shaking hands, mutual respect, trustworthiness. The United States can't be trusted at all. If we can reset, we'd have to go back in time, like Back to the Future. But if we can get up to the point where we can reset so that when the Cold War 2.0 ends, and it's not with one side winning, the other side losing, it's with both sides saying, no more Cold War, let's be friends. Let's truly be friends and move forward together. That's why I propose a new Cold War, because what's happening right now, we're broke. How can we be trusted? Our president was in a conversation with the Russian president that was designed to hold him in place while the Ukrainians sent 91 drones to kill him. That's just not the way nation states work. We are not serious about peace with Russia. We have a CIA director that is fully engaged in a covert war to bring down bring down Russia. We have a Secretary of Treasury whose number one purpose is to impose sanctions that break the Russian economy. This is not language of peace, love, and happiness. The Spirit of Alaska turns out to have been a fraud. And so rather than play these dangerous games, because as Vladimir Putin said in his speech, promises were made and promises were not kept. A lot of promises are being made today, and they're not going to be kept because the United States is not a trustworthy partner. We need a new Cold War so that we can relearn what it means to treat the Russians with respect. And then, and only then, can we possibly be the trustworthy partner Russia needs to live in peace.
Segueing to that massive landmass that exists between Russia and the United States, will the Kremlin encourage the Greenland talk in order to watch the slow disintegration of NATO?
Well, it's curious. Peskov came out and said, one way or another, Trump's going down in history. It's a curious statement. He didn't. He said this doesn't mean good or bad. It just means if Trump takes Greenland, he will go down in history. And the implication is that Trump is going to break everything that existed previously in terms of U.S.-European relations. The Russians have never been for that. You heard Vladimir Putin say, we have tried over and over again to create a framework, a security framework between Europe and Russia, the United States and Russia. A security framework is one that's premised on the notion that both sides have legitimate interests that must be respected. The Russians live next door to Europe. They don't want to destabilize Europe. They would like a Europe that has its act together. They would like a Europe that is thriving, because a thriving Europe, therefore, can be more easily linked to a thriving Russia. And yet, on the other hand, you're looking at the United States that is using NATO as an extension of American foreign policy, and the American foreign policy is singularly geared towards the strategic defeat of Russia. And so sometimes they say the best course of if the enemy is doing what you want them to do, don't get in their way. And right now, the Russians view NATO as an existential threat. And what Donald Trump is doing could lead to the dissolution of NATO and the elimination of this existential threat without Russia having to lift a finger. So I think the Russians will continue to articulate in favor of international law because, as Vladimir Putin said, that's what makes civilized society civilized. But if the relationship between the United States and Europe is so poisoned that Greenland is even possible, it's not Russia's job to fix that relationship. It's Russia's job to be ready to step in when that relationship collapses and do what's necessary to secure the interests of Russia. And what I think you'll see is that there will be a race between the United States and Russia to curry the favor of individual European nations as the European Union collapses and as NATO disintegrates.
Here's the comment, actually earlier today, this morning, Moscow time, from Peskov. Chris, cut number 9.
However, there are international experts who believe that if Trump resolves the issue of Greenland's annexation, he will undoubtedly go down in history, and not only in the history of the United States, but in world history as well. And I repeat once again, without discussing whether this is good or bad, it's hard to disagree with these experts. That's probably all that can be said on this topic.
Now,
that's like saying if Adolf Hitler invades Poland, he's going to go down in history one way or the other.
Right. It's neither positive nor negative at this point. Apparently, the president just had, while you and I have been on air, a telephone interview with NBC News, in which he says he will, quote, 100% hit European nations with fresh tariffs if a Greenland deal is not reached. When asked by NBC if he would take Greenland by force, he answered, no comment.
Yeah, no, this is a done deal. It's going to happen. And the ramifications of it, I mean, on social media, there's a wide range of people on social media. There's so many people out there who consider themselves to be chest-thumping patriots, and they're all jumping up and down about Greenland. And I have to tell you, honestly, if you're an American citizen and you're happy about the president taking Greenland, you're not a very good American citizen. You're not very patriotic, because this isn't about patriotism. I've often been critical of the Germans of the 1930s. I feel that they stood aside and did nothing as Adolf Hitler rose to power. And Adolf Hitler, it was a gradual rise to power as he gradually assumed powers. We have a president today that feels that he can occupy American cities, that his ICE warriors, his ICE army operates above all other law, and jackbooted thugs can, commit crimes and not be held to account. We have a militarized police force that is, again, they view, when they go out on patrol every morning, it's as if they view that they're patrolling enemy territory. How can the United States of America be enemy territory to an American police officer? And yet this is the mindset we have. We have a president who says international law doesn't matter. He has invaded a country. He has kidnapped a leader. He has waged illegal war of aggression against other nations. He tried to assassinate the leader of a nation with the most nuclear weapons in the world. We are a nation that has completely lost track of who we are and what we are. We live in a different world than our founding fathers. And I know, there was cautioning about do not go out in search of enemies and all that, but George Washington and company didn't have to fight World War II. We did, and we helped defeat Imperial Japan and fascist Germany. The Soviet Union, of course, played a huge role in both of those. So did our other allies. But we were leaders in a coalition that defeated these two forces. The United States today is more closely aligned with the actions and ideology of the fascist entities that we defeated than the nation that defeated them. And this should send a shockwave up Americans. We are becoming the good Germans who stood by and did nothing as their country transitioned into the most horrible country in the history of the world. So when Dmitry Peskov says that Donald Trump is going to make history. Trust me, it's not that kind of history that you want to be aligned with.
Agreeing essentially with what you said, but in his own inimitable comedic way, just to end this very serious session on a light note, our mutual friend George Galloway, Chris, cut number 12.
It is unable to join the more gung-ho members of NATO. That's relative, of course. The French sent 15 soldiers. The Germans sent 15 soldiers and then quickly withdrew them. The British have sent 1 soldier. That's right, 1 soldier. They can't join the more gung-ho Europeans because Britain is an American-occupied country. And we're occupied by American military bases. They're called Royal Air Force bases, but you won't find the king saluted in them. All of my lifetime, we've been told the Russians were coming. The Russians were about to invade Europe, and we had to spend like billio on military hardware. We had to possess nuclear weapons because the Russians were coming. And as it turns out, it's the Americans that are coming, and the Russians have no interest in the matter whatsoever. It's enough to make a horse laugh. It certainly got me laughing.
No, I love George Galloway. He has a sense of humor that is second to none, and he's as articulated as the day is long. I'm often intimidated when I have conversations with him because I find myself, when he finishes speaking, and expect me to say something saying, dude, I can't touch that. I mean, I can't touch what you just said. It's brilliant. So, but he's right. I mean, we're in an Alice in Wonderland type situation right now, where we're literally chasing, the rabbit down the rabbit hole, and entering a fantasy world of horror and where the laws of nature no longer apply. And maybe it's just because I'm a boomer. I often get criticized. You're a boomer. Well, hell yeah, I am. I mean, I'm proud of it. 64 years on this earth, and I wouldn't trade any of those years in for anything because of the experience gained from each one of them. But that means that I go back a long way, and the America that I knew as a child, and I knew growing up, and that I knew as a young adult, that America no longer exists, and that's not a good thing.
Scott Ritter, thank you very much, my dear friend. Thanks.
Cool. Follow me.